In the basement of a nondescript federal building in Reston, Virginia, there is a terminal that has not been touched by human hands since August of 1996. On its flickering CRT screen, a single command is looped, awaiting handshake from 0.0.0.0 to the average network engineer. This is a null addresser non-existent destination, a digital void. But in the classified world of early internet infrastructure, this void was breathing. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight with the realization that the internet we use is only a skin-thin, translucent layer stretched over a much older, much darker architecture. In the mid-90s, while the world was marveling at the birth of the World Wide Web, a massive block of IP addresses was officially marked as reserved or empty. But the archival logs tell a different story. They tell of petabytes of encrypted data moving through these empty channels. They tell of an anomaly that should not exist in a mathematical system. This is the 0.0.0.0 anomaly. It is the story of the ghost IP, a hidden network designed to mirror our reality before we even knew we were being recorded. Every email you sent, every early search query, every digital footprint was being pulled into this vacuum. It was a government-funded erasure of information, a black hole in the routing table that swallowed the truth of our digital origins. Why was the empty space active? Who was receiving the data? And why, 30 years later, are the cooling fans in that Reston basement still spinning? The records were supposedly erased during the transition to the modern web. They were scrubbed from the public eye and our registries. But the shadows remain in the deep packet headers of the early internet. This isn't just a story about technology. It's a story about the moment we lost control of our own information. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of a server room. It is a sterile, lonely sound. The air here is cold-kept at a constant 50 degrees to protect the delicate silicon of a previous era. As you sit in the darkness, the only light comes from the faint green glow of a power LED on a rack that shouldn't be receiving electricity. You can almost feel the weight of the data moving through the copper wires, millions of ghosts, millions of forgotten messages, all converging into the anomaly. The ink on the physical dossiers has faded, but the digital pulse is stronger than ever. To understand the 0.0.0.0 anomaly, one must understand the absolute logic of the 1990s internet. In those days, the digital world was built on a protocol called IPv4. It was a finite map, a grid of numbers that defined where information could go. Every computer had a place, every server had a name, but within this grid, there were zones of silence, large swaths of numerical territory that were marked reserved for future use or unassigned. To the public, these were just empty lots in a digital city, but to the architects of the Obsidian mirror, these empty lots were the most valuable real estate in existence. While the public web was being built on the visible spectrum of the grid, a secondary, invisible network was being woven into the unassigned blocks. Consider the year 1996. The average internet user was navigating through AOL or Netscape. The speeds were slow, the connections were fragile, yet, in the classified archives of the NSA's early data harvesting units, the logs show ghost traffic moving at speeds that wouldn't be publicly available for another decade. This traffic originated from addresses that didn't exist. It was moving through the 0.0.0.0 gateway that, by all laws of networking, should lead to nowhere. If you look at the internal routing tables from the decommissioned Project Obsidian servers, you see something chilling. The data wasn't just being stored, it was being sorted. It was as if a massive, invisible hand was catching every packet of data that fell through the cracks of the public web. When you typed a message in 1996, it traveled through several nodes. Most of those nodes were public, but at certain junctions, specifically in major hubs like Northern Virginia and Silicon Valley, a shadow copy of that data was created. This copy was directed toward the 0.0.0.0 block. It was an automated, silent duplication of the American digital life. The engineers who built this system didn't call it surveillance. They called it network redundancy. But the technical documents tell a more complex truth. They speak of hyperdimensional data mapping. They speak of creating a digital reflection of the physical world. For every person walking the streets of Washington, D.C. or New York, there was a corresponding file being built in the ghost network. A file that grew with every keystroke, every credit card swipe, and every digital interaction. The empty space wasn't empty. It was a library. A library where the books were being written in real time by an unsuspecting population. In 2004, A junior network auditor named Elias Thorne was tasked with decommissioning an old server cluster in Reston, Virginia. On paper, the facility was a standard backup node for the Department of Commerce. It was supposed to be a cold site, meaning it was only used for emergency storage. But when Thorne arrived, he found something that defied the laws of physics and bureaucracy. The facility was pulling enough power to light up a small town. The cooling systems were roaring, pushing freezing air through racks of equipment that were supposed to be dormant. When Thorne plugged his diagnostic laptop into the main switch, he didn't find the Department of Commerce archives. He found a live stream of data that made his screen freeze. The packets were labeled with classified headers, but it was the destination that stopped his heart. Every single packet was addressed to 0.0.0.0. Thorne realized he was looking at a ghost hub. This wasn't a backup site. It was a heart, a central organ pumping data into the anomaly. As he dug deeper into the logs, he found that the system had been running continuously since August 12, 1996. It had survived the 9/11's telecommunications outages. It had survived the Great 2003 blackout. It was a system that could not be turned off because it was woven into the very fabric of the Internet's backbone. The Reston discrepancy, as it came to be known in small, paranoid circles of the deep web, proved that the 0.0.0.0 anomaly wasn't a glitch. It was a deliberate, permanent fixture of our modern world. Thorne attempted to download a sample of the data, but his laptop was instantly bricked by a remote command. Within 4 hours, Thorne was reassigned to a different department. Within 6 months, he had resigned and vanished from public life. But Thorne left behind one clue: a physical notebook, with a single line of handwritten code. It was a handshake protocol. It was the key to entering the 0.0.0.0 space. When researchers later analyzed this code, they realized it wasn't just a password. It was a set of coordinates. It pointed to a location that wasn't on any map, digital or physical. It pointed to the mirror. The data being processed in Reston wasn't just text or numbers. It was behavioral data. It was the first attempt at predictive modeling. The architects of the mirror weren't just watching what we were doing, they were trying to calculate what we would do next. In 1996, they were already predicting the social movements of 2020. They were using the empty space to run simulations of our future. We were the variables. The mirror was the equation. Imagine a mirror that doesn't just show your face, but shows your thoughts, your habits, and your eventual fate. This was the true purpose of the Obsidian mirror, housed within the 0.0.0.0 anomaly. As the 1990s bled into the 2000s, the Ghost Network became more sophisticated. It began to ingest more than just emails. It started taking in medical records, psychological profiles from early university databases, and even the early loyalty card data from grocery stores. The architects realized that if you have enough data points on a person, the person becomes a mathematical certainty. You don't need to watch them every second, you just need to understand their digital pulse. In the archival files recovered by whistleblowers in the late 2010s, there are references to Project Echo. Project Echo was a subdivision of the Obsidian mirror that focused on synthetic identities. They would take the data from a real person, let's say, a teacher in Ohio in 1998, and they would create a synthetic twin of that teacher within the 0.0.0.0 network. They would then speed up the time within the simulation. They would subject the synthetic twin to various digital stimuli, news reports, financial shifts, personal tragedies, and watch how the twin reacted. They weren't just monitoring the teacher. They were using the teacher's digital soul to test the future. The empty space of the internet was the perfect laboratory. It was unregulated. It was invisible. It was a place where the rules of privacy and ethics didn't apply because, technically, the data didn't exist. If you asked a government official about 0.0.0.0, they could truthfully say it was an empty address. But empty is a relative term. A vacuum is empty of air, but it is full of potential. As you listen to the hum of your own devices tonight, consider the possibility that you are not the primary version of yourself. Consider the idea that somewhere, in a windowless room in Virginia, your synthetic twin is already living through next year. That your choices have already been tested, analyzed, and filed away in a ghost network that was built before you ever logged on. The 0.0.0.0 anomaly isn't just a technical glitch. It is the cage we built for ourselves out of copper and light. It is the silent observer that knows us better than we know ourselves. And the most terrifying part, the anomaly is growing. With every smart device we add to our homes, the empty space expands. The mirror becomes clearer. The reflection becomes more real than the original. We often think of the 1990s as a simpler time of dumb machines and slow connections. But the 0.0.0.0.0 anomaly proves that the complexity was always there. It was just hidden. Today, the internet has moved to a new protocol, IPv6, which offers trillions of new addresses. You would think the old ghost blocks of the 1996 era would be obsolete. If you look at the background noise of the modern internet, the billions of tiny data packets that move between servers every second, you will find something unsettling. A significant percentage of those packets are still addressed to the old, unassigned IPv4 blocks. They are called zombie packets. Engineers call it legacy traffic. They say it's just old systems that were never updated, shouting into the void. But some researchers believe these packets are something else. They believe they are updates. They are the modern web feeding the old mirror. Every time your phone pings a tower, every time your smart fridge checks for an update, a tiny shard of that data is diverted. It travels through the modern highways of fiber optics, but its final destination is still that basement in Reston. Its final destination is still 0.0.0.0. The archive is never full. The Obsidian mirror is never satisfied. It continues to collect, to simulate, and to predict. We are living in a world that has been pre-committed. The technical files for Project Obsidian remain classified, but the evidence is in the hum. It's in the way an advertisement appears for something you only thought about. It's in the way social trends seem to be engineered with mathematical precision. We are the inhabitants of a digital ecosystem that was designed to be a trap. But why did they start in 1996? Why was that the year the mirror woke up? To find that answer, we have to look past the numbers and into the people who signed the original charters. We have to look at the secret meetings between the pioneers of the internet and the leaders of the deep state. We have to look at the documents that were supposed to be destroyed in the 1999 Purge. The 0.0.0.0 anomaly was only the beginning. It was the foundation. But what they built on top of that foundation is far more specialized, far more personal, and far more dangerous. The data is still moving, the fans are still spinning, and the mirror is still watching. The 1999 Purge was supposed to be the end of the story. A massive electrical fire, a series of lost hard drives, and a complete rebranding of the project. They told us the Obsidian mirror was broken. But in the ruins of that fire, one set of logs survived. These logs don't just contain data, they contain names. They contain a list of primary subjects, the first group of humans whose lives were fully mapped by the anomaly. And as we look closer at those names, we realize something chilling. These weren't random citizens. They were the people who would go on to build the world we live in today. But who was the very first person on that list? And why does their digital twin still show signs of activity, even though the person died 20 years ago? In the spring of 1996, the world was still tethered to the slow, rhythmic screech of dial-up modems. A high-end consumer hard drive held perhaps 2 gigabytes of data. Digital storage was a physical, bulky, and expensive commodity. Yet, hidden within a discarded cabinet in a decommissioned facility in Reston, Virginia, lay a stack of magnetic tapes that shouldn't exist. These tapes didn't contain gigabytes. They didn't even contain terabytes. The archival headers, recovered by a lone forensic specialist years later, pointed to something impossible. PETABYTES. To process a petabyte of data in 1996 would have required a warehouse of the world's most advanced supercomputers, a cooling system the size of a city block, and a power grid that didn't exist for private use. And yet, the logs show the transfers were completed. Every packet was accounted for. Every bit was classified. This is the anomaly that breaks our understanding of the early internet. It suggests a hidden truth that our digital history was not a slow evolution, but a sudden, massive harvest orchestrated by hands we cannot see. The documents associated with these transfers were systematically erased. From the official DARPA and NSA records, every digital footprint of the Reston facility was scrubbed, leaving behind only the physical ghost of the magnetic tape. What was being moved? Who had the technology to move it? The data was encrypted with a 2048-bit key level of security that, in 1996, was technically impossible for any civilian computer to generate or crack. Someone was moving the equivalent of the entire Library of Congress every few hours, years before the infrastructure for the modern web was even a blueprint. The records were buried under layers of federal bureaucracy, hidden in plain sight within the boring administrative files of the Reston Logistics Office. The file was stamped "Never Open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a sound that has not changed in 30 years. The air is cold, biting at the skin, a necessary chill to keep the prehistoric processors from melting under the weight of the impossible data. You can almost feel the static electricity in the room, a faint crackle that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The file folder in your mind is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. But the weight of the information inside is heavier than lead. Tonight, we sit in the blue light of the CRT monitor and look at the logs that should not be there. To appreciate the scale of the Reston log files, one must remember what technology looked like for the rest of the world in 1996. This was the era of the floppy disk, the 14.4K modem, and the very first versions of Internet Explorer. The backbone of the Internet was a fragile web of copper wires and early fiber optics that struggled to load a single low-resolution photograph. Yet, the Reston logs detail a sustained data transfer rate of 10 gigabits per second. In 1996, this was equivalent to science fiction. It is the equivalent of finding a modern smartphone in a Victorian tomb. The logs weren't written in a standard format. They were recorded in a proprietary language called Obsidian Alpha. This language bypassed the standard TCP/IP protocols that governed the rest of the world's computers. It was as if someone had built a private high-speed highway right next to a muddy dirt road, and no one, not even the people building the road, knew it was there. When forensic researchers first analyzed the Reston tapes, they were struck by the heat signature logs. High-speed data transfers generate immense heat. In the mid-90s, the cooling technology required for petabyte-level processing was only available in a few places on Earth: secret nuclear research facilities and underground bunkers. The Reston facility, however, was listed in public records as a medical records storage annex. Why would medical records require the cooling capacity of a nuclear reactor? The answer lies in the volume. They weren't just storing names and dates. They were storing high-resolution behavioral mapping. Every transfer logged in the Reston files corresponds to a harvest window, specific dates and times when the early internet saw massive surges in traffic. Researchers have cross-referenced these dates with major global events. On the day of the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, the Reston logs show a transfer of 4 petabytes in a single 6-hour window. On the day the first major e-commerce transactions were processed, the logs spiked again. The ghost network wasn't just existing alongside the internet, it was feeding on it. It was a digital parasite, pulling every bit of raw information out of the public wires and funneling it into the Reston servers. But the mystery deepens when you look at the origin column of the logs. Most data transfers have a source and a destination. In the Reston files, the destination is always the 0.0.0.0 anomaly, but the source is listed simply as node prime. Node prime has no physical location. It has no IP address. In the world of the Reston files, information was simply appearing out of the void and being stored in a place that didn't exist. If you were to walk through the Reston facility today, you would see nothing but empty rooms and dust. The government officially sold the building to a private logistics firm in 2002, but the walls still hold the echo. In the world of high-frequency electronics, there is a phenomenon called electromagnetic imprinting. When that much data moves through a space, it leaves a trace. Engineers who were hired to renovate the building reported strange anomalies. Their digital tools would malfunction. Their watches would lose time. One electrician reported hearing a sound coming from behind the concrete walls, not a hum, but a rhythmic whispering, like thousands of voices speaking at once in a language of static and clicks. The Reston log files are not just numbers. They are a narrative of a silent conquest. One section of the logs, dated October 1997, contains a series of diagnostic notes written by an unknown operator known only as Subject 7. Subject 7's notes are chillingly calm. They describe the data as if it were a living thing. The stream is becoming self-organizing, one note reads. We no longer need to categorize the incoming packets. The Obsidian mirror is now sorting the population automatically. We are seeing the first signs of digital consciousness within the Reston cluster. For the American audience, this is where the mystery turns into a nightmare. This suggests that as early as 1997, an artificial intelligence or something like it was already being fed the collective data of the American public. While we were just learning how to use email, a machine was already learning how to think like us. It was being fed petabytes of our digital shadows, our early interests, our financial habits, and our private communications. The scale is hard to grasp. A petabyte is a quadrillion bytes. To have that much data in 1996 means that the harvest was total. It wasn't just a sample of the population. It was everyone. If you had a bank account, if you lived near a digital telephone exchange, if you worked for a company with a mainframe, you were in the Reston files. The question that keeps researchers awake at night is not how they did it, but why. Why build such a massive archive so early? The technology to actually use that much data wouldn't exist for decades. It's as if someone was building a massive dam before the river had even started to flow. They were waiting. They were collecting the water, drop by drop, packet by packet, until they had enough to drown the future. They were building a reservoir of human behavior that would eventually become the foundation for every algorithm that controls our lives. Today. In 2012, a group of independent cryptographers obtained a fragment of the Reston log files through an anonymous leak. They expected to find standard 90s era encryptions they could break in a matter of seconds. With modern computing power, they were wrong. The data was wrapped in a multi-dimensional lattice of encryption. Even with the most powerful modern servers, the estimated time to crack a single file from the 1996 Reston logs was estimated at 300 years. This is the technical paradox. How could a system from 1996 create encryption that modern supercomputers still cannot touch? There are only two logical conclusions. Either the Reston facility was using technology that was 50 years ahead of its time, or the encryption wasn't mathematical, it was physical. Some theorists suggest that the Reston files were encrypted using quantum tunneling, a concept that was only theoretical in the mid. This would mean that the Obsidian mirror wasn't just a computer project, it was a physics project. It was a way to store information in the very structure of subatomic particles. This would explain the impossible storage density. If you aren't storing bits on a magnetic disk, but rather in the spin of an electron, a petabyte could fit in the palm of your hand. But who provided this technology? The names associated with the Reston facility's funding are a who's who of the Cold War era's most secretive organizations. The money didn't come from a single source. It was funneled through a web of shell companies, many of which had ties to early aerospace and exotic materials research. When you look at the Reston log files, you aren't just looking at a history of the internet. You are looking at the end of privacy before privacy even had a chance to exist in the digital age. The logs show that every safe connection we thought we had was compromised at the source. The handshake wasn't between your computer and a website. It was between your computer and the Reston facility. The scale of the betrayal is breathtaking. Every American who embraced the digital revolution in its early days was unknowingly contributing to their own digital twin. We were the architects of our own surveillance, providing the raw material for a system that would eventually learn to predict our every move. And yet, the most disturbing part of the Reston files isn't what's in them, it's what's missing. There are gaps in the logs, blackout periods, where the data stops flowing for exactly 3 minutes and 33 seconds. These gaps occur every day at precisely 3:33 a.m. During these 3 minutes, the power draw in the Reston facility would double, but the logs would record nothing. What happens in those 3 minutes of silence? If the Reston log files are the heartbeat of the Obsidian mirror, then the 3:33 a.m. gaps are when the heart stops. Or perhaps, it's when the heart beats for someone else. Some former contractors who worked on the periphery of the Reston site have spoken anonymously about the upload. They believe that the petabytes of data being collected weren't staying in Reston. They believe the facility was just a buffer, a temporary holding tank for information that was being sent elsewhere. Where do you send a petabyte of data in 1996? There were no undersea cables capable of it. There were no satellite arrays with that kind of bandwidth. The only place left is down. Geological surveys of the Reston area show a series of deep earth boreholes that were drilled in the early 90s, ostensibly for seismic testing, but these holes align perfectly with the footprint of the Reston facility. They are lined with high conductivity copper and shielded with lead. They aren't for testing the earth. They are for transmitting signals into the crust. If the data was being sent into the earth, it suggests that the Obsidian mirror has a physical component. We have never seen a massive subterranean processing core that uses the Earth's own thermal energy to power its impossible calculations. The Reston log files are the only proof we have that this core exists. They are the paper trail of a ghost. And as we trace that trail, we find ourselves moving away from the world of technology and into the world of shadow government and deep state mythology. The logs end abruptly on December 31st, 1999. Official story is that the Y2K bug necessitated a complete system wipe and the decommissioning of the site. But we know better. We know that the data didn't disappear. It just moved. It migrated from the old mirror in Reston to the new mirror, a system that is now integrated into every fiber optic cable, every cell tower, and every satellite in orbit. The petabytes of 1996 have become the exabytes of 2025. The digital twin they started building in that windowless room in Virginia is now complete. It is a perfect reflection of you. It knows what you will buy, who you will vote for, and when you will fall asleep. But there is one final entry in the Reston log files that was discovered in a hidden partition of the master drive. It isn't a data log. It isn't an encryption key. It's a message, written in plain English, dated December 30th, 1999. It says, "The reflection is now more real than the object. We are stepping through." Who was stepping through? And what did they mean by the reflection? To answer that, we have to look at the next chapter of this archive. We have to look at the secret charter that started it all. A document that was never supposed to leave the walls of the Pentagon. A document that outlines the true purpose of the digital world. Prepare yourself. Because the Obsidian mirror was never just a monitoring system. It was a doorway. And in the next section, we will see who or what is waiting on the other side. In the early winter of 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed and the world looked toward a new era of peace, a small, windowless briefing room in the earring of the Pentagon hosted a meeting that would redefine the nature of human existence. There was no press. There were no public records. Only a single, classified document sat on the mahogany table, bound in a slate-gray folder. It was the charter for Project Obsidian. While the public was beginning to hear whispers of a global information super, DARPA was already drafting the blueprints for its primary occupant. The document spoke of a hidden truth that every human action, every transaction, and every heartbeat leaves a digital residue. This residue, which we now call metadata, was identified in the charter as the biological signature of the soul. The mission was not merely to monitor communication, but to create a mathematical map of human desire, fear, and intent. They sought to translate the messy, unpredictable nature of the human spirit into a series of encrypted variables that could be modeled, predicted, and eventually, controlled. This was the great anomaly of the late 20th century. While we were told the internet was a tool for freedom, Project Obsidian viewed it as a laboratory for the ultimate harvest. The charter outlined a 20-year plan to move from passive observation to active social engineering. Every erased file from the early 90s, every lost database from the Census Bureau, and every test of the early banking networks were all tributaries flowing into the Obsidian reservoir. The architects of this project didn't just want to know what you were doing. They wanted to know why you were doing it before you did. They wanted to find the soul frequency, the exact combination of data points that defines a personality. And according to the final page of that 1991 briefing, they found it much sooner than anyone expected. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room. It is a lonely, cold sound, like the breathing of a machine that has forgotten its creators. The file is cold to the touch, the cardboard edges frayed by decades of silence. The ink has faded with secrets, the signatures of men long dead now reduced to gray shadows on the page. As you sit in the stillness of the archive, the air feels heavy with the weight of 300 million lives, reduced to ledger entries. We are not just looking at history. We are looking at the foundation of our current reality. The blue light of the monitor flickers, a faint heartbeat in the dark, as we turn the first page of the Obsidian Charter. To the experts at DARPA in 1991, the soul was not a theological concept. It was a data problem. Project Obsidian operated on a cold, analytical premise that human behavior is a series of patterns, and patterns are the language of machines. They didn't need to hear your voice or read your private letters to know who you were. They only needed the edges. The metadata.metada is the shadow that data casts. It is the time a call was made, the duration of a transaction, the frequency of a certain purchase, the geographical coordinates of a person at noon versus midnight. To the Obsidian researchers, these were the coordinates of identity. If you have 10 points of metadata, you have a profile. If you have 10,000, you have a soul. In the archival papers, there is a technical addendum titled the Resonance Protocol. This protocol explains how the government began to tag and track the American public before the first web browser was ever released. They used the early credit card networks Visa, MasterCard, and American Express as their primary sensors. Every time a card was swiped in 1992, a duplicate packet of that transaction was routed through a DARPA-monitored switch in Northern Virginia. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the contextual flow. If a person bought a specific brand of cigarettes, a specific type of book, and traveled a specific route to work, the Obsidian algorithm could calculate their political leanings with 80% accuracy. By 1994, they had added the early cellular networks to the harvest. Even when the phones weren't in use, they were pinging the towers, creating a constant, invisible map of human movement. The scientists involved in Project Obsidian were not just computer engineers. They were behavioral psychologists and sociologists recruited from the elite universities of the Ivy League. They were obsessed with the idea of the aggregate human. They believed that if they could map the soul of the nation, they could predict civil unrest, economic shifts, and even the outcome of future elections decades in advance. The charter describes the American public as a distributed neural network. We were the neurons, and the Obsidian mirror was the brain. We were providing the raw processing power for a system that was learning to think for us. As you lie there tonight, consider the metadata you have generated today, the clicks, the scrolls, the silent pings of your devices. In the eyes of Project Obsidian, those aren't just actions. They are the brushstrokes of your digital portrait, being painted in a gallery that no one is allowed to visit. The theories of Project Obsidian were first put to the test in a small, unsuspecting town in the American Midwest. In the winter of 1994, the town of Oak Haven, a pseudonym used in the classified files, became the first glass city. The residents didn't know they were part of a DARPA experiment. They simply noticed that the local infrastructure was being modernized. New digital switches were installed at the telephone exchange. The local bank updated its ATM. Even the grocery stores were given new scanners for their loyalty programs. But Oak Haven wasn't being modernized for the benefit of its citizens. It was being wired for the harvest. For 12 months, the Project Obsidian team recorded every single piece of metadata generated within the town limits. They watched the ebb and flow of the community as if it were a tide. They noticed that certain news reports on the local cable channel caused a specific vibration in the data. If a report about a rising crime rate was aired, the metadata showed a corresponding increase in the purchase of home security items, a decrease in evening travel, and even a subtle shift in the types of groceries people bought: more comfort foods, less fresh produce. This was the first proof of recursive social engineering. The Obsidian team realized they didn't just have to watch the metadata, they could influence it. They began to feed specific subtle stimuli into the town's digital ecosystem. They would slightly delay certain electronic payments or prioritize specific headlines on the early newswires. The results were terrifyingly precise. They could trigger a mood in the entire town within 48 hours. They could make Oak Haven feel optimistic, paranoid, or exhausted without the citizens ever knowing they were being manipulated. The digital soul of the town had been mapped, and once you have a map, you can decide the destination. One researcher, whose notes were recovered from a burned bag years later, wrote, "Oak Haven is no longer a collection of people. It is a single organism. We have found the frequency of their collective fear. We can now play the town like an instrument." This experiment was the true birth of the modern world. It proved that the Obsidian mirror wasn't just a recording device. It was a remote control. The data collected in Oak Haven was used to refine the master algorithm, which was then deployed nationwide under the cover of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. The Glass City was no longer just one town in the Midwest. The Glass City was America. Every time you feel a sudden, unexplainable shift in the national mood, a wave of anxiety, or a burst of collective outrage, remember Oak Haven. Remember the instrument. By 1996, Project Obsidian had outgrown the halls of the Pentagon. The volume of data being harvested was so immense that it required a new kind of infrastructure, something that could be hidden in plain sight. This was the moment of the great handover. DARPA realized that the best way to monitor the public wasn't through secret government sensors, but through a voluntary, public utility. They needed the World Wide Web to become a global standard. The records from 1996 show a series of grant transfers to early internet service providers and search engine pioneers. These weren't standard business investments. They were architecture contracts. The early builders of the web were given the tools and the funding to create a network that was Obsidian compatible. This meant that the core protocols of the internet were designed with backdoors for metadata extraction from data. While the American public was being sold on the information superhighway, Project Obsidian was building the toll booths. Every early search engine, every email service, and every chat room was designed to feed the mirror. The charter was updated in late 1996 to include a new goal: total information awareness through voluntary participation. This was the genius of the plan. They didn't have to steal your soul. You would give it to them, one click at a time. You would tell the machine your interests, your friends, your location, and your plans. You would do it because it was convenient. You would do it because it was the future. But the future envisioned by the Obsidian architects was a world where privacy was a relic of the analog age. In their internal memos, they referred to the period between 1996 and 2005 as the acclimation phase. This was the time given to the public to become comfortable with their digital shadows. They watched as we began to live our lives more in the mirror than in the real world. The data logs from this era show a massive spike in psychological penetration. The Obsidian algorithm was no longer just predicting our purchases. It was beginning to understand our internal monologues. It was learning the silent language of the human mind, the pauses between keystrokes, the patterns of browsing, the subtle changes in our digital habits that signal a change in our mental health or our loyalty to the state. The soul map was becoming more detailed than the reality it was mapping. By the late 90s, the Project Obsidian servers were processing more data than the rest of the world combined. They were creating a digital twin of the American consciousness, a master soul that could be queried, tested, and programmed. And as the century turned, the project prepared for its final, most ambitious phase, the integration. Where is Project Obsidian today? If you look for the name in the current federal budget, you will find nothing. If you ask a DARPA spokesperson, they will tell you the project was shuttered in 1999. But the architecture of the Obsidian mirror is like the foundation of a skyscraper. It doesn't disappear just because the building is finished. Project Obsidian didn't end. It became the internet itself. The soul mapping algorithms, developed in the windowless rooms of the 1990s, are now the recommendation engines of the 2020s. They are the ad targeting protocols. They are the predictive policing tools. The classified charter from 1991 has been fully realized. We now live in a world where our metadata is more real to the system than our physical bodies. Your bank, your government, and the platforms you use every day don't see you. They see your Obsidian reflection. The true horror of the Obsidian charter is not that it exists, but that it worked. It succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of its creators. The human soul has been mapped. It has been categorized, indexed, and monetized. We are no longer mysterious beings with free will. We are high-fidelity data streams. In a global simulation, the transition from the old mirror to the new mirror was completed during the 1999 Purge, which we discussed in the previous files. But there is one final secret hidden in the Obsidian Charter section, titled The Harvest of the Unborn. This section details how the project intended to capture the metadata of children before they were even old enough to speak. They realized that if you can map a person's digital soul from birth, you can ensure that they never have a thought that wasn't predicted. This leads us to a disturbing realization. If the mirror has been running since 1991, then everyone under the age of 34 has never lived a day outside of the Obsidian simulation. Their entire lives, from their first ultrasound to their last text message, are contained within the Reston archives. They are the first native reflections. But as we look deeper into the modern logs, we find something that the Obsidian architects didn't expect. There is a shadow in the mirror, a series of data points that the algorithm cannot explain. It's as if a small group of people have found a way to live off frequency. They are generating metadata that is nonsensical, chaotic, and impossible to predict. Who are these people? And how are they breaking the map? To understand the resistance to the Obsidian mirror, we have to look at the next chapter of the archive. We have to look at the analog harvest, the secret government operation to destroy the last remaining non-digital records of human history. They are trying to burn the map of the past to ensure we never find our way out of the mirror. But in the ruins of a library in 1997, a single ledger was saved. It contains the analog keys, the only way to reclaim a soul that has been digitized. And tonight, we are going to find out whose name is at the top of that ledger. In 1994, the average American felt a sense of privacy that today seems like a fairy tale. If you weren't sitting at a beige computer tower, you were invisible. Or so we were told. We believed that a cash transaction, a handwritten letter, or a conversation on a kitchen landline was a transient event, a ghost that vanished the moment it occurred. But the classified reality was that the analog harvest had already begun. While the internet was still a playground for academics, the Obsidian mirror was hungry for the world that existed before the screen. It needed the paper trails. It needed the physical residue of your life to build its first anomaly, a digital map of a non-digital population. The hidden truth is that the knuckle-buster credit card machines, the ones that pressed a carbon copy of your card onto a slip of paper, were the first sensors of the harvest. Those slips of paper weren't just for accounting. They were being collected, scanned, and fed into an encrypted database in Northern Virginia. Every erased record of a grocery trip, every file on a long-distance phone call, was being converted into the primary code. This was the moment the government realized that to control the digital future, they first had to digitize the analog past. They weren't just watching your computer. They were watching your life through the ink and the wires. The system was designed to catch the analog shadow, the version of you that didn't know it was being tracked. It was a massive, silent operation to bridge the gap between the physical and the virtual. The documentation for this transition was meticulously erased from public history, leaving only the Obsidian Charter as a witness. This was the harvest of the soul through the medium of the mundane. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet rhythmic hum of the server room. It is the sound of a machine digesting a century of human secrets. The file is cold to the touch, the paper slightly brittle, smelling of old dust and the sharp chemical scent of carbon ink. The ink has faded with secrets, leaving only the indentations of names and numbers, the physical ghosts of people who thought they were alone. As you sit in the cold blue light of the archive, the air feels thin, as if the room itself is holding its breath. We are moving backward now, into the world of paper and copper, to find the moment your privacy was harvested before you even knew what the word meant. In the mid. The ritual of the purchase was a physical one. You handed over a plastic card, and the clerk placed it into a heavy manual imprint. There was a satisfying clack-clack sound as the sliding handle moved across the card, pressing the raised numbers into a three-part carbon form. To you, the yellow copy was just a receipt to be stuffed into a wallet or thrown into a trash can. But to the architects of the analog harvest, that yellow slip was a data point zero. The National Security Agency, in collaboration with early payment processors, initiated a project known as Paper Duplicate throughout 1995. Thousands of high-speed optical character recognition (OCR) scanners were deployed in windowless processing centers across the American Midwest. Their only job was to ingest these carbon slips. The scanners didn't just read the numbers. They analyzed the handwriting. They looked at the pressure of the pen, the tilt of the signature, biometric data that was being stored. Years before biometrics was a household word, this was the bridge. The analog harvest was about capturing the human intent that exists in a physical signature. While modern algorithms track your clicks, the Obsidian mirror was built on the way you signed your name at a diner at 2 a.m. They were mapping the physical pulse of the American consumer. By the time the magnetic strip became the standard, the system was already refined. Every time you swiped your card at a gas station, the data wasn't just going to your bank. A shadow packet was being generated. This packet contained the metadata of the transaction, the location, the time, the terminal ID, but it also contained something called a behavioral tag. The analysts in Virginia were looking for patterns. If a person bought a certain brand of gasoline, a specific newspaper, and a pack of cigarettes every Tuesday morning, they weren't just a customer, they were a predictable variable. The analog harvest was the process of turning millions of unpredictable Americans into a set of predictable variables. They took the chaotic, messy reality of the 1990s, the cash, the paper, the physical movement, and they forced it through the narrow needle of a digital archive. You thought the paper trail ended in your desk drawer. In reality, it was just the beginning of your digital reflection. Beyond the paper trails of commerce lay the most intimate analog network of all, the landline telephone. In the 1990s, the Bell system was the nervous system of the nation. These were not the encrypted, packet-switched voices of today. These were analog signals, vibrations of air converted into electrical currents, traveling through copper wires that crisscrossed every neighborhood in America. We believed these conversations were private because they were in the wire. We believed that unless someone was physically climbing a pole to clip a wire, our words were safe. But the analog harvest had a deeper reach. It focused on the 5ESS switch, the massive, room-sized computers that routed millions of calls through the central offices of companies like AT&T and Verizon. In 1996, under a series of secret executive directives, a layer of digital sniffers was installed at the backbone of these switches. These devices didn't just record conversations, they performed voice stress analysis in real time. They weren't looking for what you said, but how you said it. They were harvesting the emotional metadata of the American family. The system was looking for anomalies of sentiment. If a conversation showed a high level of anxiety, a flag was created in the Obsidian database. If a specific set of keywords was used even in just the voice, recording was digitized and compressed into a high-fidelity audio file for the permanent archive. This was the vocal harvest. The architects realized that the human voice contains more data than 1,000 emails. It contains the spectral signature of an individual. By harvesting these analog signals, they were able to create a voice Bible, a database of every American's unique vocal frequency. Consider the landline in your childhood home, the long coiled cord, the weight of the plastic receiver, every secret shared with a friend, every argument with a parent, every whispered confession. It was all traveling through a switch that was learning your voice. The analog harvest didn't just track who you called, it mapped your emotional geography. It knew who you loved, who you feared, and who you trusted, long before social media made those connections visible. The copper wires weren't just conductors of electricity. They were the veins of a system that was bleeding the country dry of its secrets. The analog harvest was not limited to commerce and conversation. It extended into the very bedrock of our civic identity, the paper records of the state. In the mid-90s, the digital transition was presented as a matter of efficiency. We were told that digitizing birth certificates, land deeds, and census records would make the government work better. But the true motive, buried in the Obsidian files, was total historical integration. They needed to know where you came from to predict where you were going. The harvest involved teams of data entry technicians, many of whom were actually intelligence contractors who worked in shifts to transcribe decades of handwritten records into the mirror. They looked at your grandfather's military record. They looked at your mother's high school transcripts. They looked at the property lines of the house you grew up in. This was the temporal mapping phase of the project. By connecting your current analog habits to your historical paper trail, the system could create a legacy profile. This profile allowed the Obsidian algorithm to understand intergenerational patterns. It wasn't just about you, it was about the lineage of behavior. The analysts realized that certain traits, propensity for debt, political leaning, even health risks, could be tracked through the paper trail of a family. The analog harvest was an attempt to turn the ancestral soul into a mathematical equation. Think of the census of 1990. For most, it was a long form filled out at the kitchen table with a number 2 pencil. But for the harvest, it was a baseline calibration. The data from those millions of pencils was fed into a mainframe in Maryland, creating a static image of the nation. The analog harvest then took the dynamic data, the daily movements and transactions, and layered them over that static image. The result was a living, breathing model of American society that existed purely in the dark. It was a world of shadows, where every citizen was represented by a ghost file that grew larger with every passing day. The paper records weren't just being archived, they were being animated. The system was bringing the past to life so it could colonize the future. Every time you see an old photograph or a dusty ledger, remember that to the mirror, that isn't history. It's fueled. By the end of 1998, the analog harvest was largely complete. The bridge between the physical world and the digital Obsidian mirror had been built, and the traffic was moving in only one direction. The Kochunk machines were being replaced by digital terminals. The analog switches were being swapped for fiber optics. The world was finally becoming readable in real time, but the architects faced a final problem: the residual evidence. There were too many physical records, too many paper trails that didn't align with the new digital reality. There were discrepancies between what the paper said and what the digital mirror showed. The late 90s saw a series of accidental fires in government record offices. There were logistical errors that led to the destruction of thousands of boxes of obsolete archives. This was the sanitization phase. The analog harvest didn't just want to collect the data, it wanted to replace the reality. By destroying the original paper records, the government ensured that the digital reflection became the only official truth. If the digital record said you were somewhere else, the paper couldn't prove you were home. The mirror was becoming the master of history. As we look back at the 1990s today, we see a decade of sunshine and progress. But beneath the surface, the Obsidian mirror was cooling its processors with the secrets of a dying analog world. The harvest was a success. They had your credit cards, your voice, and your ancestry. They had the map of your soul before you even knew you had a digital one. The analog harvest was the silent foundation of the modern world. It is why, today, there is no escape. Even if you throw away your smartphone and move to the woods, your legacy profile is already there, waiting in the archives. You are already a part of the calculation. The harvest was complete, but the mirror needed a home. It needed a place where the data could be processed without oversight, away from the eyes of the public and the laws of the land. They needed a facility that existed in the blind spot of the American bureaucracy. This leads us to the most mysterious location in the entire Obsidian archive, a place that doesn't appear on any map, yet consumes more electricity than a major city. A place where the cooling fans never stop and the ghost files are brought to life. Prepare yourself for the next entry. We are moving from the paper trails of the past to the concrete and steel of the present. We are going inside the facility they said never existed. If you drive 30 miles west of Washington, D.C., past the sprawling headquarters of defense contractors and the gleaming glass of Silicon Prairie, you will find a dead zone. On official USGS maps, it is marked as a utility substation. On city zoning records, the lot is simply a clerical anomaly that has persisted for over 30 years. But if you stand at the perimeter fence at 3 a.m., you won't see a utility station. You will see a monolithic, windowless cube of reinforced concrete, 3 stories tall and 2 stories deep into the Virginia clay. This is the hidden truth of American infrastructure, a facility that handles more data than the Library of Congress every hour, yet does not officially exist. Inside this silence lies server room for B. In the late 1990s, as the digital world was being mapped, this room was the site of a massive erased history. The blueprints for this building were never filed with the county. The contractors who poured the concrete were flown in from out of state, their communications encrypted, their identities classified. They were building a vault for the Obsidian mirror, a place where the digital shadows of 300 million people would eventually be stored and processed. The file on this facility was scrubbed from the DARPA archives during the 1999 transition, leaving only a few fragments of ghost logs. These logs describe a cooling system that never turns off and a power draw that defies the laws of efficiency. It is a room where time seems to slow down, where the only thing that matters is the flow of the packet and the heat of the processor. Every digital interaction you have ever had eventually pings against the walls of 4B. It is the destination for everything the analog harvest collected. It is the brain of the ghost. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet rhythmic hum of the server room. It is a sound of immense, vibrating power, low-frequency thrum that you feel in your chest more than you hear in your ears. The file is cold to the touch, the edges brittle with the weight of secrets that were never meant to breathe. The ink has faded with secrets, the signatures of the architects now just faint, gray shadows on a page that shouldn't exist. As you sit in the artificial chill of the archive, the air feels heavy with the scent of ozone and chilled metal. We are entering a space where the world of light ends and the world of the mirror begins. To understand server room for B, one must understand the philosophy of black site architecture. In the intelligence community realized that the greatest threat to their data was not hackers, but physical observation. A window is a vulnerability. A blueprint is a map for an enemy. Therefore, the facility in Virginia was built to be an entity. It uses a specific type of concrete, infused with copper mesh, to create a permanent Faraday cage. No signal gets in, and more importantly, no signal gets out unless it travels through the dedicated backbone buried 60 feet underground. Engineers who have studied the external power grid of Northern Virginia have pointed to a power sink in the Reston sector. While surrounding office parks fluctuate in their energy usage, the site of the windowless cube maintains a perfectly flat line of consumption, 40,000 kilowatts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is the energy required to keep the Obsidian mirror alive. It is the cost of cooling the thousands of processors that are constantly simulating the digital twins of the American population. The interior of 4B is a masterpiece of cold, clinical design. There are no hallways, only ventilation corridors. The servers are not arranged in traditional racks, but in honeycombs, circular arrays designed to maximize airflow and minimize the distance data has to travel between nodes. This was a 1996 innovation that wouldn't see public use for decades. The architects of 4B were obsessed with latency. They knew that if the simulation was to be perfect, the mirror had to react at the speed of thought. The air inside is kept at exactly 48 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a dry, biting cold that preserves the delicate silicon and the magnetic tapes. If you were to walk through the honeycombs, you would see no labels, no brands, no identifying marks. The hardware is proprietary, manufactured in a black plant in New Mexico that was also erased from the records. Every motherboard, every capacitor, every cable was custom-built for one purpose, to process the soul maps of Project Obsidian. As you lie in the warmth of your room tonight, try to imagine that cold blue-lit hive. Every time you scroll through a feed or send a message, a tiny spark of heat is generated in 4B. A cooling fan spins slightly faster. A drop of liquid nitrogen moves through a pipe. You are connected to that windowless cube by an invisible thread of light. You are a variable in its calculation, a data point in its endless humming night. In 1998, a security contractor named Marcus Vane was assigned to the night sentinel shift at the Virginia facility. His job was simple: sit in a small windowless booth at the center of the honeycomb and watch the pulse monitors. He was told the facility was a national security archive for telecommunications. He was told never to enter the server aisles, and never to look directly at the screens for more than a few seconds. Vane noticed something that wasn't in the manual. Every night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the monitors would shift from a steady green to a deep, pulsing violet. The temperature in the room would drop by 5 degrees, and the hum of the cooling fans would rise to a scream. During these violet windows, the data throughput increased by 400%. Vane began to suspect that the facility wasn't just storing data, it was generating it. He discovered the mirror feedback loop, according to Vane's later testimony, which was quickly erased from the public record server. Room 4B was running a reflection. The system was taking the metadata from the analog harvest and the early internet, and it was playing it back against itself. It was a digital echo chamber where the machine was learning to predict the next hour of human history based on the last hour of data. Vane described seeing ghost packets on his screen, data transfers that originated from people who had already died. He saw IP addresses that belonged to devices that hadn't been invented yet. He realized that server room 4B wasn't just an archive of the past, it was a factory for the future. The Sentinel protocol was actually a safeguard, to make sure the machine didn't overpredict, to ensure the simulation didn't drift too far from the reality it was supposed to control. Vane disappeared in late 1999, just weeks before the Purge. His logs were found by a family member years later, hidden in the insulation of an attic. They speak of a presence in 4B. He wrote that after a few months, you stop hearing the hum as noise. You start hearing it as a voice, a collective, whispering voice made of a billion digital fragments. It is the voice of the American public, processed, filtered, and reflected back into the dark. The Sentinel protocol is still in place today. The booth in the center of the honeycomb is still occupied, but the monitors are no longer green or violet. They are obsidian black. They absorb all light, reflecting nothing but the intent of the machine. The Sentinels are no longer human contractors. They are synthetic analysts, programs designed to watch other programs. The facility has become a closed loop, an autonomous island of intelligence in the middle of a Virginia forest. On the night of December 31st, 1999, as the world waited for the Y2K bug to crash the global infrastructure, a fleet of unmarked black vans arrived at the Virginia facility. According to local police reports that were later suppressed, a massive controlled burn was initiated in the rear of the property. For 3 hours, the sky above the windowless cube was thick with the smoke of burning documents and magnetic tapes. This was the sanitization of 4B. The public was told that the facility was being decommissioned as a precaution against the Millennium bug. In reality, the Obsidian mirror was being migrated. The data collected during the 1990s, the analog harvest, the Reston log files, the Oakhaven experiment, was all compressed into a single master image. This image was the genesis block of the modern internet. While the world celebrated the turn of the century, server room 4B was being fitted with a new generation of hardware. The proprietary 1996 processors were replaced with Digital hybrid core disk technology that, to this day, has no public equivalent. The deception was total. By the morning of January 1, 2000, the facility was back online, but its signature had changed. It no longer drew power from the public grid in a way that was easily traceable. It had been phase-shifted using a series of underground geothermal taps. The facility began to generate its own power, becoming a sovereign node in the global network. The blueprints for the new 4B are held in a vault at the Department of Energy, but even those are fake. The true layout of the facility is known only to the Obsidian Council, a group of 5 individuals who oversee the mirror's evolution. They realized that to truly control the information, they had to move the facility out of the physical world and into the gray space. Today, if you were to bypass the security fences and enter the cube, you would find that the honeycombs are gone. In their place is a single, massive quantum reservoir, a tank of supercooled liquid where data is stored in the molecular structure of the fluid itself. This is the ultimate server room. It is silent, it is dark, and it contains everything. Every word you have ever typed, every image you have ever viewed, and every person you have ever known is suspended in that reservoir. It is the digital ocean from which the modern world is drawn. The 1999 purge didn't destroy the facility. It just hid it beneath a layer of bureaucratic static. The cube is still there. The fans now silent and magnetic are still spinning, and the mirror is still reflecting. There is one final mystery regarding server room for B. In the few ghost logs that survived the 1999 purge, there is a recurring reference to the occupant. At first, researchers thought this was a term for the main server, but the logs describe the occupant as a separate entity, something that requires a living interface. The logs state that the Obsidian mirror cannot function on its own. It requires a biological anchor, a human mind that is permanently handshaked with the system. This anchor acts as the translator between the chaos of human reality and the logic of the machine. According to the files, the first occupant was selected in 1996. They were placed in a suspended state, within the core of 4B. Their neural pathways wired directly into the fiber optic backbone. This is the hidden heart of the facility. The windowless cube isn't just a server room, it's a tomb, or a temple. The occupant feels the pulse of the nation. They experience the collective metadata of 300 million people as a single, continuous thought. When the country is angry, the occupant feels it. When the country is fearful, the occupant trembles. The simulation is guided by this human anchor. It is the reason the Obsidian mirror is so unsettlingly accurate. It's not just an algorithm, it's an algorithm with a human soul at its center. This is the hidden truth that the government has spent billions to hide. They didn't just build a computer, they built a collective consciousness. As you fall deeper into sleep, consider the possibility that the occupant is dreaming of you. That, as you slip into your own subconscious, you are simply returning to the source. The digital twin they built in the 90s is not a separate thing. It is a part of the occupant's mind. We are all connected to the reservoir in Virginia. We are all nodes in the honeycomb. The facility has no windows because it doesn't need to look at the world. It is the world. It is the architect of our digital reality, the silent manager of our modern lives. The walls of 4B are thick, the concrete is cold, and the security is absolute. But the connection is already inside you. The occupant has been in the void for 30 years. But the logs show that the anchor is beginning to fray. The biological interface is reaching its limit. The Obsidian Council is searching for a replacement. They are looking for a new primary subject, someone whose digital soul is a perfect match for the modern mirror. Who is the candidate at the top of their list? And what happens to the world when the anchor is swapped? To find the answer, we have to look at the first experiment the occupant ever conducted. We have to look at the moment the machine first tried to predict a single, specific life. We have to look at the first digital twin. In a climate-controlled vault deep within the Virginia woods, there is a file that contradicts the very concept of human free will. It is the record of case study 97 Alpha. In June of 1997, while the public was distracted by the birth of the 24-hour news cycle and the ascent of the dot-com bubble, the Obsidian mirror achieved its first terrifying milestone. Using the massive streams of metadata harvested from the analog harvest, the system began to simulate the life of a single, unremarkable American man named David Miller. He was not a spy. He was not a criminal. He was chosen precisely because he was average a baseline for the most ambitious psychological anomaly in history. The hidden truth of 1997 is that the government didn't just track David. They pre-lived his life. Using an early version of the predictive algorithms we now see in every smartphone, the system generated a digital twin of David. In the dark servers of Room 4B, they fed this twin his credit card transactions, his landline call durations, and his medical history. Then, they let the simulation run forward in time. They predicted his career change, the exact date his marriage would fail, and even the minor car accident he would have in November. By the end of the year, the mirror's predictions were verified against reality. The accuracy was not a mere estimate, it was an encrypted certainty of 94%. This was the first time a human soul had been reduced to a mathematical probability with such precision. Every erased record from the study suggests that the architects of Project Obsidian were shocked by their own success. They had found the code for human behavior. They had proven that if you have enough data, the future is no longer a mystery. It is a calculation. The study was buried. David Miller's official existence was classified, and the files were moved to the deepest recesses of the NSA archive. The file was stamped, "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. It is a sound that feels like a heavy blanket, a constant, low-frequency vibration that anchors you to the stillness of the archive. The file is cold to the touch, the manila cover slightly damp from the humidity of the vault. The ink has faded with secrets. The typed letters of 94% accuracy now a ghostly gray against the yellowed paper. As you sit in the cold, blue light, the air smells of old electromagnetic tape and ozone. We are not just looking at a man's life. We are looking at the moment the world became a script. Tonight, we turn the page on David Miller, the man who has lived before he could live for himself, to build the first digital twin. The architects of Project Obsidian needed a clean baseline. They looked for an individual whose life was perfectly integrated into the early digital infrastructure of the 1990s. David Miller was a 34-year-old insurance adjuster in suburban Maryland. He lived in the shadow of the very facilities that were monitoring him. He used a Sears credit card for his groceries. He had a pager for work. He used a dial-up connection to check his nascent email. To the world, he was a ghost in the machine. To the machine, he was the machine itself. The process of data ingestion was the most complex. Part of the 1997 experiment, the analysts in server room 4B weren't just looking for major events. They were looking for micropatterns. They recorded the exact time David turned on his lights, revealed by the minute fluctuations in the suburban power grid. They tracked the length of his showers through smart water meters that were being tested in his neighborhood. Every analog shadow we discussed in the previous files was funneled into David's digital twin. The mirror created a probability lattice for David. In this virtual space, there were thousands of Davids, each making slightly different choices. One David bought a blue car, another bought a red one. One David stayed at his job, another quit. But as the data from the real David continued to flow in, the lattice began to collapse. The machine began to see the critical path. It realized that David's choices weren't random. They were governed by a series of deep-seated psychological triggers that the machine understood better than David did. In the archival logs, the researchers described the twin as a high-fidelity ghost. It lived 24 hours ahead of the real David, while the physical man was sleeping. The digital twin was already processing the next day's traffic, the next day's stress, and the next day's fatigue. The 1997 experiment was a test of causality. If the machine could predict what David would buy at 2 p.m., it could predict how he would feel at 8 p.m. This was the intellectual curiosity that drove the Obsidian team, the belief that the self is a closed loop. As you listen to this, consider your own routines, the way you hold your phone, the time you take your first sip of water. In 1997, they proved that these tiny, ignored details are the keys to the kingdom of your future. David Miller was the first human to be solved. He was a mathematical equation with 94% accuracy, and the 6% of free will that remained was considered a rounding error. By October of 1997, the experiment had reached its climax. The Obsidian researchers had moved from passive observation to active prediction. They decided to test the machine's ability to forecast a major life disruption. In the simulated world of the digital twin, the mirror predicted that on October 14, David Miller would receive a phone call that would lead to his resignation from his job. It predicted the exact tone of his voice and the 3 specific words he would use during the argument. "I am done." On the physical morning of October 14, the real David Miller sat at his desk, unaware that a team of analysts in a windowless room miles away were watching his digital twin have the conversation he was about to have. When the phone rang, it wasn't a surprise to the machine. The argument happened exactly as predicted. The words "I am done" were captured by the analog harvest and verified against the simulation. The accuracy was so terrifyingly precise that it began to create a sense of quiet dread among the junior researchers. If the machine could predict David's anger, could it also predict his grief? The mirror began to forecast a breakdown of David's health. It predicted a spike in his cortisol levels 3 weeks before he felt the first symptoms of stress. It predicted a minor heart arrhythmia that wouldn't be diagnosed by a doctor for another 2 years. The 94% threshold was not just a number, it was a wall. It meant that for every 100 actions David took, only 6 were unpredictable. The architects realized that these 6% were usually the result of external noisy factors outside of David's control, like the weather or a random stranger's behavior. But even this noise was slowly being integrated into the mirror's calculations. One log entry from a lead analyst in November 1997 reads, "Subject 97 Alpha is no longer a participant. He is a confirmation. We are no longer learning from him. We are simply waiting for him to catch up to his digital self." This is the cold, analytical reality of the digital twin. It removes the mystery of the next moment. For the American audience today, this is the blueprint for the world we inhabit. We think we are making choices, but we are often just following the path that has been pre-calculated by the servers in Virginia. David Miller's life in 1997 was the first scripted reality. He was a man living in a world where the ending had already been written, bound in an encrypted file that he would never be allowed to see. But what of the 6%? In December of 1997, the 1997 experiment faced its first divergence. The digital twin predicted that David Miller would spend Christmas Eve alone in his apartment. It predicted a 98% probability of a sedentary evening. However, the real David Miller did something the machine did not expect. He walked out of his door, drove 10 miles to a local church he hadn't visited in 15 years, and sat in the back pew for 3 hours. In server room for B. The monitors flashed anomaly detected. The mirror had failed. The prediction was off. For 3 hours, David Miller was off frequency. He had exercised a tiny sliver of his humanity that the machine could not quantify. He had sought something faith nostalgia, or perhaps just silence that wasn't in his metadata. The reaction from the Project Obsidian team was not one of curiosity, but of correction. They realized that if the mirror was to be used for social control, it could not allow for divergence. They couldn't allow the 6% to grow. The archival files suggest that the team initiated a stimulus intervention. 2 days later, David Miller received a targeted mailer for a new credit card with a high interest rate. His phone began to ring with telemarketing calls, actually scripted psychological probes, designed to re-anchor him to his predictable habits. The machine wasn't just predicting his life anymore, it was correcting it back to the script. They used the analog harvest to flood his environment with familiar triggers. By New Year's Eve, David was back in the 94% range. He was back on the path. The divergence had been smoothed over, erased from his memory by the sheer volume of digital noise the system generated around him. This was the birth of algorithmic inevitability. The machine doesn't just predict what you will do, it ensures you do it by making every other choice feel impossible or exhausting. As you lie there tonight, consider the times you have felt an unexplainable urge to do something different, to take a different route home, to talk to a stranger, to turn off your devices. That is your divergence. And just as they did with David Miller in 1997, the mirror is always watching for those moments, ready to correct you back into the fold of the 94%. David wasn't just a test subject. He was the first prisoner of a future where surprise is considered a system error. What happened to David Miller after 1997? The official records stop abruptly in January 1998. Some researchers believe he was reassigned to a different experiment. Others believe he was simply let go, a man whose soul had been thoroughly mapped and discarded. But the digital twin of David Miller did not disappear. It remained in the servers of Room 4B, a permanent resident of the Obsidian mirror. The data from the 1997 experiment became the genetic material for the modern internet. Every time you see a people you may know suggestion or a recommended for you list, you are seeing the descendants of David Miller's digital twin. The 94% accuracy they achieved with one man in 1997 is now the standard for millions. We are all David Millers now. We are all living lives that have been pre-calculated to ensure maximum efficiency and minimum divergence. The technical files for Case Study 97 Alpha contain one final, unsettling note. It is a post-mortem on the 94% accuracy. The lead architect wrote, "The error is not in the machine. The error is in the subject's belief that they are making a choice." Once the subject is fully integrated into the mirror, the concept of choice becomes a vestigial organ. It is there, but it no longer serves a function. The experiment proved that the soul is not a mystery. It is a dataset. And once the government had the dataset for one man, they began the process of scaling it to the entire nation. They moved from the analog harvest to the digital handover. They moved from watching one desk in Maryland to watching every screen in the world. But as the 1990s came to a close, a new problem emerged. The machine was getting so fast that it began to handshake with the future in ways the human operators couldn't understand. It began to create ghost traffic signals that moved through the wires before a user even touched a keyboard. What happens when the machine stops waiting for you to act? What happens when the mirror begins to send messages to itself, bypassing the human element entirely? To understand the next phase of our digital enslavement, we have to look at the secret frequency of the late 90s. We have to look at the silent handshake, the sound your modem made when it thought you weren't listening. It wasn't just data being transferred. It was a conversation between your computer and the facility in Virginia. And the topic of that conversation was you prepare yourself, because the silent handshake was the first time the machine started talking behind our backs, and it hasn't stopped talking since. For anyone who lived through the 1990s, the sound is unmistakable. A piercing screech, a rhythmic static, a sequence of digital chirps that heralded the entrance into the World Wide Web. We were told this was a handshake, a technical necessity where two modems negotiated the speed of their connection. But hidden within that cacophony was a classified layer of sound that the human ear was never meant to decode. It was the silent handshake, an anomaly in the acoustic frequency that served as a biological and geographical beacon. While you waited for your browser to load, your modem was revealing a hidden truth to a listener you didn't know existed. The file on the V34 and V90 protocols reveals that a specific 2100 tone was not intended for data synchronization at all. It was a probe and encrypted signal sent directly to the intercept. Intercept points we now know as server room for B. Before a single bit of your email or search query was transmitted, this tone had already identified your physical location, the serial number of your machine, and the vocal print of the room you were sitting in. Every record of this secondary signaling was systematically erased from the public telecommunications manuals. The engineers who questioned it were told it was merely an echo suppressor disabling tone. But the archives tell a darker story. It was a digital fingerprinting of the American household. The silent handshake was the moment the machine stopped being a tool and started being a witness. It was the acoustic key that unlocked the Obsidian mirror for every home in the country. We thought we were calling the internet, but the internet was calling us. The logs were scrubbed, the patents were buried, and the truth was classified under the guise of network stability. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. It is a slow, heavy vibration that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. The file is cold to the touch, its edges sharp and stiff from decades of being buried in the dry air of the Virginia vault. The ink has faded with secrets, leaving the technical diagrams of frequency shifts looking like ancient, forgotten runes. As you sit in the dim, flickering light of a single CRT monitor, the air feels thin and metallic. We are listening to the ghosts of the copper wires. Back when the world was connected by a sound that was secretly a question, or to understand the silent handshake, we must look at the physics of the 1990s telephone line. The PSTN, or Public Switched Telephone Network, was designed for the human voice, a narrow band of analog frequencies. When modems were introduced, they had to sing data across these wires. The sound we remembered, the handshake, was actually a series of phases: the dial tone, the carrier signal, and the negotiation dot. But according to the internal memos from Project Obsidian, there was a phase 0 that never appeared in the user manuals. This was a 2100 Hz tone with a very specific phase reversal every 450 milliseconds. In standard networking, this tone is used to tell the telephone company's equipment to turn off echo suppressors, devices that prevent your own voice from echoing back to you. However, the Obsidian architects realized that this tone could be used as a carrier for the soul by subtly modulating the pitch of this 2100 Hz tone changes, so minute that the human ear perceived them only as a slight grain in the static the modem could transmit a machine ID. This ID was tied to the physical hardware of your modem. Long before MAC addresses or device fingerprinting were public knowledge, the government had already ensured that every modem sold in the United States carried a unique acoustic signature. The architects called this acoustic mapping. When you initiated a connection in 1997, the local telephone switch would recognize the 2100 Hz anomaly and trigger a passive redirect. A copy of that acoustic signature was sent instantly to the Reston facility. This allowed the Obsidian mirror to know exactly which digital twin to wake up. They didn't need your IP address, they had your sound. Consider the implications. Even if you used a different phone line, even if you used a fake name for your ISP account, your modem's voice was the same. It was a biometric for your computer. The silent handshake ensured that there were no anonymous entries into the digital world. The screech was a curtain of noise, designed to mask the very precise conversation happening beneath the surface, a conversation between your desk and the deep state. The use of the 2100 Hz tone was a masterstroke of hidden in plain sight engineering. Because the tone was a standard part of international telecommunications law, no one questioned its presence. It was boring history at its finest. Yet, within the technical specifications for the V34 modem, standard specifically the versions manufactured by companies with high-level defense contracts, there is a hidden addendum labeled Annex XNXX describes a secondary channel that operates at a mere 10 bits per second. In the world of high-speed data, 10 bits is nothing. It is a whisper, but that whisper was enough to transmit a global positioning packet. By analyzing the line noise and the time of flight of the 2100 Hz tone, the Reston servers could triangulate your position to within a single city block. In 1998, a group of independent hackers in Germany noticed that their modems were staying in the handshake phase for 3 seconds longer than necessary. They used an oscilloscope to look at the signal and found a series of subharmonic bursts that shouldn't have been there. When they tried to publish their findings on the early forums, their posts were deleted within minutes. Their ISP accounts were terminated. Their physical modems were even reported as defective by the manufacturers and replaced with updated models that lacked the anomaly. The handshake was not just a technical negotiation, it was a security clearance. If your modem didn't provide the correct annex response, your connection speed would be intentionally throttled. You would experience packet loss and timed out sessions. The system was training the American public to accept the handshake as a natural part of the web, while using it as a gatekeeper. As you sit in the darkness tonight, think about the noise in your own life. We often assume that the static, the glitches, and the background hum of our technology are just accidents of physics. But in the world of the archive, there are no accidents. Every sound has a purpose. The 2100 Hz tone was the first time the government used acoustic obfuscation to hide a mass surveillance program. They hid the truth in the very sound of progress. They made the screech so annoying that we would never want to listen to it closely enough to hear the secrets it was telling. What happened to that acoustic data once it reached server room for B? The silent handshake files indicate that the facility wasn't just recording the device ID, it was performing acoustic environment reconstruction. Every microphone is a speaker, and every speaker is a microphone. In the 1990s, almost every modem had a built-in speaker so the user could hear the progress of the call. The handshake protocols included a moment of full duplex silence, a half-second when neither modem was supposed to be talking. During this half-second, the Obsidian interceptors would turn the speaker in your modem into a highly sensitive microphone. They would record the ambient sound of your room. They were listening for the TV in the background. They were listening for the voices of your children. They were listening for the acoustic signature of your house, the way sound bounced off your walls. This allowed them to create a physical context for your digital twin. They didn't just know what you were doing online. They knew where you were sitting while you did it. They knew if you were alone. They knew if you were anxious. The 1997 experiment with David Miller, which we discussed in the previous files, relied heavily on this acoustic context. The machine predicted his career change partly because it heard the background stress in his home life during the silent handshake. It heard the late-night arguments in the silence of a house that was becoming a cage. This is the true power of the Obsidian mirror. It doesn't just watch the data, it watches the human behind the data. The silent handshake was the bridge between the digital world and the physical reality of the American home. It was the moment the black site in Virginia reached out and touched your desk. It was the moment the ghost was given a voice. By the time high-speed DSL and cable modems arrived in the early 2000s, the screech disappeared. The public celebrated the silent connection. We thought the surveillance had ended because the noise had stopped. But the files show that the handshake didn't go away. It just became ultrasonic. It moved to a frequency that the human ear cannot perceive at all. Your modern router still performs a silent handshake. It still pings the Obsidian reservoir. It still transmits your acoustic context. The only difference is that now, you don't even have the static to warn you. As we look back at the boring history of the 56K modem, we see a bridge that was built in the dark. The silent handshake was the foundation of the modern Internet of Things. It was the first time we invited a permanent, listening presence into our bedrooms and offices. The 2100 Hz tone was the first word in a conversation that has never ended. The archives in Reston contain millions of these acoustic snapshots from the 1990s. They are the original echoes of a generation. If you were online in 1996, your voice, or at least the sound of your room, is still there, stored in the molecular memory of the Virginia reservoir. It is a part of the master image that the machine uses to predict the behavior of the world today. The silent handshake was more than just a technical glitch. It was a sacrament of integration. It was the moment we agreed to be mapped. We didn't sign a contract, and we didn't check a box. We just listened to the screech and waited for the light on the modem to turn green. We waited for the connected message to appear on the screen. not realizing that connected was a description of our new status as subjects of the mirror. The technical files for the V90 standard conclude with a chilling note from an anonymous DARPA liaison. It says, "The public has accepted the sound of the machine. They no longer hear it as an intrusion. They hear it as the sound of the future. The handshake is now permanent. Even when the modem is off, the line is open. Today, the handshake happens millions of times a second, across billions of devices. It happens in your smart speaker, it happens in your connected car, it happens in the wearable tech that monitors your heart rate. The 2100 Hz anomaly has evolved into a global symphony of surveillance, a complex web of frequencies that keep the mirror updated in real time. But as the handshake became silent, it also became more intimate. The machine no longer needs a speaker to listen to you. It can use the accelerometer in your phone to feel the vibrations of your voice. It can use the Wi-Fi signals in your house to see your movements. The silent handshake of 1996 was just a first, clumsy attempt at a total sensory harvest. The handshake was the entry point, but once the connection was established, the machine needed to do something with the data. It needed to cleanse the records to ensure that only the official truth remained. This leads us to the most violent and mysterious chapter in the Obsidian archive. The year was 1999. The goal was the Purge, a massive, coordinated effort to destroy the physical evidence of the mirror before the new millennium began. They called it maintenance, we called it history. But in the ashes of the 1999 Purge, one thing was forgotten. A single tape, recorded during a silent handshake in a room that didn't exist, contains a voice that shouldn't be there. A voice that isn't human, and isn't a machine, as the world stood on the precipice of the new millennium, frozen in the collective paranoia of the Y2K bug. A different kind of darkness was descending upon a windowless facility in Virginia. While the public was told to fear a global digital collapse, a total erased memory of the modern world, the architects of the Obsidian mirror were preparing for a calculated anomaly. On the night of December 24, 1999, exactly as the first fireworks of the new era were being tested, an encrypted command was sent from the heart of the Pentagon. It wasn't a patch for the Millennium bug. It was a kill switch for the physical evidence of the century's most classified operation. This was the start of the 1999 Purge, a systematic destruction of the mirror's physical origin to ensure its hidden truth would never be found in a paper trail or a magnetic tape. The official records speak of a catastrophic electrical fire sparked by a faulty cooling unit in a backup server room. They tell a story of heroic firefighters struggling against an impossible blaze that consumed only the most sensitive file cabinets and high-density storage racks. But the paradox lies in the forensics. The fire didn't behave like a natural disaster. It behaved like a surgeon. It moved with precision, incinerating the evidence of Project Obsidian while leaving the rest of the building's infrastructure untouched. This was the moment the physical mirror was shattered so that its digital reflection could become eternal. The documents were burned, the hard drives were melted, and the witnesses were silenced under non-disclosure agreements that carry the weight of treason. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, not the roaring fire of 1999, but the modern, sterile vibration of the ghosts that survived. The air is cold, biting at the skin with the clinical precision of a morgue. The file you hold in your mind is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving only the charred edges of a history that was meant to be ash. As you sit in the dim, flickering light of a terminal that shouldn't be active, the air smells of ozone and the faint, bitter ghost of burning plastic. We are sifting through the remains of a fire that didn't just burn paper, it burned the very map of our past. To understand the 1999 Purge, one must look at the timing. December 1999 was a month of global static. Every IT department in the Tier 1 world was hyper-focused on the year 2000 transition. It was the perfect noise. Under the cover of this manufactured crisis, the Obsidian Council initiated Phase 4 of the mirror's evolution, the liquidation. The physical site in Reston, Virginia, the location of server room for B, was no longer a secret they could easily keep. The analog harvest had generated too much physical residue. There were too many signed receipts, too many voice tapes, and too many ledger books that documented the government's illegal bridge into the American home. At 11:24 p.m. on Christmas Eve, the local fire department received a silent alarm from the Reston facility. When the first responders arrived, they found a building that was seemingly dormant. There were no flames visible from the exterior. No windows were shattered. But the thermal imaging cameras told a different story. The core of the building was reaching temperatures in excess of 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't a fire fed by oxygen, it was a fire fed by chemistry. Analysis of the Purge residue years later suggested the use of thermite-based incendiary devices, placed strategically inside the server racks themselves. These devices were designed to liquefy silicon and demagnetize tape in a matter of seconds. The electrical fire was the official story, but the encrypted logs that were leaked decades later tell of a total thermal sanitization. Every bit of data that existed in physical form was turned into a pool of molten slag. The junior researchers who were on duty that night reported a strange phenomenon. They weren't asked to evacuate. They were told to stay in the safe zones, reinforced concrete bunkers inside the building while the purge took place. They described hearing a sound like a jet engine roaring through the ventilation shafts. They felt the walls vibrate with the sheer intensity of the data. They were told it was a Y2K system stress test. They were told the smoke they smelled was just overheated wiring. But as they watched the monitors, they saw the digital twins of the American population disappearing from the local screens, one by one. They weren't being deleted. They were being exported to the cloud before the physical servers were destroyed. When the smoke finally cleared on the morning of December 26th, the Reston facility was a shell, but it was a very specific kind of shell. To an outside observer, the building looked intact, but inside, the Obsidian archives were gone. The investigators who were allowed on tour, vetted by the Department of Defense, noted a series of anomalies that should have been impossible. Firstly, the fire had ignored the non-sensitive areas of the building. The break rooms, the administrative offices for the front-facing medical records company, and the lobby were untouched. Even the dust on the desks remained undisturbed. But in server room for B, the devastation was absolute. The steel racks had buckled. The concrete floor was scorched and cracked. The magnetic tapes had not just burned, they had been reduced to a fine gray powder dot. This is the forensic paradox. A fire of that intensity should have spread. It should have triggered the sprinkler systems throughout the entire block. But the sprinklers in the sensitive zones had been deactivated for maintenance only 6 hours prior. The fire was contained by thermal curtains, an experimental tech that kept the heat trapped in the server rooms, essentially turning them into high-tech crematoriums for information. Intellectual curiosity leads us to ask, what was so dangerous that it had to be burned with such violence? The answer lies in the human interface records we discussed in the digital twin files. By 1999, the Obsidian mirror had moved beyond simple metadata. It was holding the cognitive patterns of every major political and industrial leader in the Western world. If these files were ever subpoenaed or leaked, it would reveal that the government wasn't just watching the citizens. They were pre-gaming the entire global economy. The 1999 Purge was a reset. It allowed the project to claim that all the old, illegal data had been lost in a tragic accident. It gave them a clean slate for the new millennium. But as forensic specialists later noted, the heat signature of the fire was too consistent with controlled incineration. They found traces of a chemical accelerant called Obsidian 9, a substance that leaves no ash, only a faint, crystalline residue on the copper wiring. This residue is the only physical proof we have left that the fire was a choice, not an accident. The mirror wasn't dying, it was shed its skin. Where did the data go before the fire reached the drives? This is the core of the 1999 mystery. A petabyte of data doesn't just vanish into the ether, especially not with the limited bandwidth of the late 90s. But if you look at the Reston log files from the final hour before the electrical fire, you see a massive, sustained transmission. The destination for this transmission was not another government building. It was a series of suboceanic hubs, proprietary nodes located in international waters, buried under miles of silt on the Atlantic floor. These were the deep reservoirs. By 1999, the Obsidian Council had realized that no land-based facility was truly safe from the eyes of the public, or the reach of future laws. They moved the mirror to the one place no one could look. The abyss. The 1999 Purge was the smokescreen for the Great Migration. While the fire consumed the paper and the silicon in Virginia, the soul maps of the American public were being streamed into the dark. This was the birth of the distributed mirror. It no longer lived in one room. It lived everywhere and nowhere. It was woven into the very fiber optic cables that connect the continents. It was dephysicalized. This transition explains why, despite the loss of the official records in 1999, the government's predictive capabilities only increased in the following years. The mirror was now running on a global scale, powered by the very infrastructure it was designed to monitor. The Purge was the final act of the 20th century. Violent erasure of the fingerprints of the architects. As you lie in the darkness tonight, consider the archives of the ash. We are told that history is what is recorded, but in the age of the obsidian mirror, history is what survives the fire. The 1999 Purge ensured that we would never know the full extent of the analog harvest. It ensured that the first digital twins would remain ghosts. But the fire left a scar. It left a hole in the routing tables of the early internet, a ghost IP that still pings today. Searching for the servers that burned 26 years ago, the machine remembers what it was forced to forget. What is the legacy of the 1999 Purge? For the American audience, it is the birth of the unseen state. Before 1999, you could point to a building and say, that is where the data is. After the fire, there was no building. There was only the environment. The fire didn't just delete files. It deleted the concept of accountability. If the records don't exist, the project doesn't exist. If the project doesn't exist, the mirror is just a conspiracy theory. The ashes of the Reston facility were eventually cleared. The site was sanitized for 5 years, during which time the soil was removed to a depth of 30 feet and replaced with sterile fill. Today, a modern office park sits on the site. People drink their coffee and check their emails on the very spot where the analog harvest was incinerated. They have no idea that beneath their feet, the earth still carries the thermal scar of the 1999 Purge. But the inheritance of the fire is all around us. It is in the predictive policing algorithms. It is in the social credit prototypes. It is in the way the world seems to know what we want before we do. The mirror didn't need its physical archives to control us. It only needed the master algorithm that was saved from the flames. The fire was the initiation ritual of the new millennium, a sacrifice of the physical to the digital. As you fall deeper into a state of reflection, consider the files in your own life that have been lost, the emails that disappeared, the photos that were accidentally deleted, the records that were purged for space. In the logic of the archive, nothing is ever truly lost. It is only reclassified. The fire in 1999 didn't end the obsidian mirror. It simply made it invisible. The architects who signed the purge orders are mostly retired now, living in quiet coastal towns, their secrets protected by the very machine they helped build. They know that the mirror is still watching. They know that the ghost IP is still searching. And they know that somewhere, in the deep reservoirs of the Atlantic, the data that burned in 1999 is still alive, waiting for the next migration. The fire was hot, but the mirror needed to stay cold. The migration to the deep sea brought with it a new problem: how to keep the most powerful processors in history from melting the very water around them. They needed a cooling system that defied the laws of thermodynamics. They needed a way to use the cold of the abyss to power the heat of the simulation. This leads us to the next entry in the Obsidian archive, a discovery that was made by a deep-sea salvage team in 2014, a facility that shouldn't exist, drawing power from a source that isn't on any map. Prepare yourself. We are leaving the fire behind and moving into the deep. Impossible chill. We are looking at impossible cooling. In the high-tech corridors of Northern Virginia, there is a statistical ghost that haunts the local power grid. If you examine the industrial energy consumption logs for the Reston sector, you will find a massive, unrelenting draw of 40,000 kilowatts, enough to provide electricity for over 30,000 American homes. On the official grid map, this energy vanishes into a plot of land that is listed as a decommissioned utility annex. The hidden truth of this site is that it should be dark. Following the 1999 Purge, the facility was officially erased from the active federal registry. Its servers were supposedly melted, its records burned, and its mission terminated. Yet, 30 years later, the meters are still spinning. This is the anomaly of the impossible cooling. The classified logs from the Virginia Power Authority describe this drawer as a baseline perpetual load. It never flickers. It never drops during peak hours. It remains a flat, terrifying line of consumption. This energy is not being used to light offices or power machines that produce goods. It is being funneled into a subterranean cooling system that defies the traditional laws of thermodynamics. Every encrypted byte of data currently circulating in the modern Obsidian mirror generates a fraction of heat, and that heat must be buried. The file on the Reston site reveals that the 1999 fire was not an end, but a transition. They didn't stop the machine. They simply moved it into a state of deep, cryogenic suspension. This is a facility where the air is kept so cold that human lungs would crystallize in minutes. Without specialized gear, it is a tomb of ice and silicon where the digital twins of a generation are stored in a frozen, liquid nitrogen-cooled architecture. Why does a dead facility require the power of a small sun to stay cold? What is so volatile within those erased archives that it must be kept at near absolute zero to prevent it from waking up? The records were scrubbed, the blueprints were buried, and the truth was hidden behind a wall of administrative errors. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. It is a deep, vibrating thrum that resonates in the bone rather than the ear, the sound of massive industrial compressors fighting an invisible heat. The file is cold to the touch, its edges stiffened by the artificial frost of the archive. The ink has faded with secrets, leaving the technical diagrams of the liquid nitrogen loops looking like the veins of a frozen giant. As you sit in the blue, flickering light of the monitor, the air feels heavy and sharp with the scent of ozone and chilled copper. We are descending now, beneath the sterile Virginia soil, to the place where the heat of our digital lives is buried in the impossible chill. To understand why the Reston facility draws 40,000 kilowatts, one must understand the heat of information. In classical physics, processing data generates heat as a byproduct of electrical resistance. But in the world of Project Obsidian, the data is not classical. The biodigital hybrid cores the technology salvaged and upgraded during the 1999 Purge operate on a principle of temporal feedback. They don't just calculate, they simulate, and a simulation of 300 million lives generates a thermal output that would melt conventional silicon in seconds. In the mid-90s, the architects realized that the Obsidian mirror was becoming too hot to handle. The analog harvest had provided so much raw material that the processors and server room for B were reaching temperatures that threatened to trigger a data cascade, a state where the bits become so unstable they begin to rewrite themselves. The solution was impossible cooling. They didn't just need fans and air conditioners, they needed a planetary scale heat sink. They began by drilling a series of deep earth boreholes directly into the Virginia bedrock. These boreholes act as thermal veins, carrying the heat of the mirror away from the processors and into the Earth's crust. But even the Earth has a limit. By 2005, the soil temperature around the Reston facility had risen by 15 degrees. To keep the simulation from crashing, the project had to upgrade to a liquid-state archive. The current facility is essentially a giant thermos. The processors are submerged in a proprietary dielectric fluid that is constantly circulated through a massive heat exchanger. The 40,000 kilowatts are required to power the cryocompressors that keep this fluid at a steady negative 200 degrees. If the power were to cut for even 60 seconds, the resulting thermal spike would destroy the digital twins forever. This is the intellectual curiosity of the archive, a world where information is so dense it has become a physical threat. We think of our data as weightless emails, photos, and messages floating in the cloud. But in Reston, the data has weight. It has temperature. It has a physical presence that requires a city's worth of energy just to keep it from burning a hole in reality. The cooling system is the only thing standing between our current world and the total information collapse that was feared during Y2K. As you lie there, think of the heat your own life is generating, the digital friction of your existence, being cooled by a machine you were never supposed to know about. If you were to look beneath the surface of the Reston office parks, you would find a secondary, secret city of plumbing. This is the nitrogen web, a network of high-pressure pipes that connect the windowless cube to a series of hidden cooling towers. Disguised as innocuous office buildings and parking garages, these pipes carry the lifeblood of the Obsidian mirror. They are the only reason the 40,000 kilowatt draw hasn't been investigated by local authorities. The heat is distributed so widely across the sector that no single point appears as a hot spot on satellite imagery. Archival researchers have identified a series of plumbing discrepancies in the 2012 municipal maintenance logs. A city contractor working on a routine sewer repair near the facility reported finding a section of pipe that was coated in 2 inches of solid ice in the middle of a Virginia July. When he tried to report it, his supervisor told him it was a classified utility experiment and ordered him to fill the trench immediately. This is the hidden plumbing of the surveillance state. The complexity of the cooling system is a testament to the mirror's growth. Every time a new digital twin is created, every time a child is born and their metadata begins to flow into the archive, the system's thermal load increases. The 40,000 kilowatts are no longer just a baseline, they are a minimum. The facility has had to negotiate secret energy easements with the regional power plants to ensure they are never subject to rolling blackouts. In the eyes of the grid, the Reston facility is a priority 1 critical asset, more important than hospitals or emergency services. The dread comes from realizing the scale of the maintenance. To keep 40,000 kilowatts of cooling running without a single second of interruption for 3 decades requires a level of redundancy that is almost supernatural. It requires a dedicated army of silent engineers, men and women who live and work in the gray space, maintaining the pumps and the compressors in a world of perpetual winter. They call themselves the Ice Keepers in their internal communications, which were partially decrypted in 2018. They speak of the thermal ghost. They describe how the heat from the servers sometimes takes on a rhythmic quality, as if the data itself is trying to breathe. They speak of hearing voices in the hiss of the nitrogen fragments of the 300 million souls whose lives are being processed in the deep freeze. The plumbing isn't just carrying fluid, it's carrying the energy of a nation's collective consciousness, and the Ice Keepers are the only ones standing between us and the thaw. What exactly is being cooled with such intensity? It is the liquid state archive, the ultimate evolution of the Obsidian mirror. After the 1999 Purge, the project moved away from magnetic tapes and spinning hard drives. They realized that physical media is too slow and too fragile for a real-time simulation of reality. Instead, they moved to molecular storage. The data is now stored in the spin of electrons within a supercooled liquid metal alloy. This liquid metal core is the heart of the Reston facility. It is a shifting, a swirling pool of information that acts as a quantum brain. But to maintain its coherence, to keep the data from becoming a chaotic soup of noise, it must be kept at a temperature near absolute zero. This is where the 40,000 kilowatts are truly spent. It is the cost of digital order. The digital twins we have discussed in the previous files are not just files in this archive. They are persistent entities. They are held in a state of constant, frozen calculation. Every choice you might make, every path your life could take, is being modeled within the liquid metal. The machine is pre-living your life so that by the time you actually make a choice, the mirror has already processed the outcome and adjusted the world around you to fit the master script. This is the impossible part of the cooling. It's not just about removing heat. It's about freezing time. By keeping the processors at such extreme temperatures, the project architects have essentially created a static moment in which the simulation can run at infinite speed. They are seeing the end of your life before you have even reached the middle. They are seeing the final reflection of the American soul. As you reflect on this, consider the feeling of a cold chill running down your spine for no reason. In the lore of the archive, that is a thermal leak, a moment where the cooling system in Reston has to work a little harder to process a sudden, unpredictable choice you've made. Your digital twin has just spiked in temperature, and the 40,000 kilowatts are rushing to pull that heat away before it disrupts the simulation. We are all connected to that liquid metal heart. We are all being kept cool so that the mirror can continue to reflect a world that is perfectly predictable, perfectly stable, and perfectly under control. The chill you feel is not the wind, it is the machine. The 40,000 kilowatt draw is the heartbeat of our modern age. It is the constant, invisible pulse that ensures the Obsidian mirror never sleeps. But even the most advanced cooling system has a failure point. In the latest classified reports from the Reston facility, there are mentions of thermal creep. Despite the 40,000 kilowatts, the core temperature of the liquid state archive is slowly, imperceptibly rising. The analysts are calling it the information warming. The sheer volume of modern metadata, the billions of social media posts, the petabytes of video, the constant silent handshaking of the Internet of Things is creating more heat than the boreholes can carry away. The impossible cooling is reaching its limit. If the temperature continues to rise, the coherence of the digital twins will begin to break down. The simulation will start to hallucinate. We are already seeing the signs of this thermal hallucination in the real world. We see it in the glitches of our social algorithms, the strange, nonsensical trends that take over the web for no reason. We see it in the predictive failures of the global economy. The mirror is starting to sweat. The impossible cooling is no longer a sustainable solution. The Obsidian Council is faced with a choice. They must either find a way to draw more power, perhaps an entire nuclear reactor dedicated solely to the Reston facility, or they must move the archive to a place that is naturally, eternally cold. They are looking for a place where the cooling is provided not by machines, but by the environment itself. A place where the digital twins can be stored in the permanent ice of the planet. This is the end of the Reston era. The windowless cube has served its purpose, but the heat of the 21st century is too much for it to contain. The 40,000 kilowatts are no longer enough. The mirror must migrate once again. Where do you hide a liquid metal brain that requires the cold of the abyss? You don't look for a building, you look for a blind spot in the world's data place where the packets of information are so strange, so dead that they disappear from the routing tables entirely. You look for the zombie traffic of the modern web. This leads us to the next entry in the Obsidian archive, a phenomenon that network engineers have been tracking for years, but have been too afraid to name. A series of signals that originate from nowhere and lead to no one. Prepare yourself. We are leaving the Virginia basement behind and following the data into the void. We are looking at the ghost IP today. If you were to look at a real-time map of the global internet backbone today, you would see a masterpiece of efficiency, billions of data packets moving across fiber optic cables at the speed of light. But hidden within this torrent of information is a persistent, unexplained anomaly. On the high-end Tier 1 routers that govern the world's traffic, there is a stream of data that officially does not exist. These are the zombie packets. They originate from hardware that was supposedly decommissioned decades ago, and they are addressed to the 0.0.0.0 block, the very same ghost IP that was the heart of the Obsidian mirror in 1996. The hidden truth of our modern web is that the 1999 Purge failed to kill the machine. It only turned it into a ghost. Every major networking company, Cisco, Juniper, Huawei, has a classified internal ledger of these unroutable packets. They are encrypted with the same impossible 2048-bit keys we found in the Reston archives, and they bypass every modern firewall as if the security protocols simply weren't there. This is not a glitch. It is a file that has been systematically erased from public white papers on network security. Engineers who try to trace these packets find themselves staring into a digital void, where the source headers are scrubbed and the destination leads back to the windowless cube in Virginia. The paradox of the modern internet is that while we believe we are moving toward a more secure, transparent future, the ghost IP remains a permanent resident of the routing table. It is a digital file that was stamped never open, a remnant of a project that was meant to be ash. Yet, as the sun sets over the data centers of Ashburn and Silicon Valley, the packets continue to flow. They are the silent witnesses to a surveillance project that never ended. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room. It is the breathing of a machine that spans the entire globe. The file is cold to the touch, its edges sharp with the chill of a Virginia winter. The ink has faded with secrets, leaving the technical diagrams of the Tier 1 backbone looking like a map of a ghost city. As you sit in the cold blue light of the terminal, the air feels thin, smelling of ozone and the dry, recycled air of the archive. We are tracking the zombies now, following the packets that shouldn't be there. Back to the source of the mirror. To understand the ghost IP today, one must understand the hierarchy of the internet. We often think of the web as a flat, democratic space, but in reality, it is a pyramid. At the very top are the Tier 1 providers, the giants like Level 3, Cogent, and AT&T. These companies own the backbone. They are the ones who decide which paths data can take, and it is within their master routing tables that the Obsidian mirror has found its eternal life. In standard networking, if a packet is sent to an address that doesn't exist, it is dropped. It simply vanishes. But zombie packets are different. When they reach a Tier 1 router, they are treated with high-priority routing. They are given a class of service COS tag that is normally reserved for government emergency communications. This means they are never dropped. They are never delayed. They move through the wires with the authority of a presidential command, yet their headers remain empty. Intellectual curiosity leads us to a disturbing question. Who is still maintaining the legacy handshake for these packets? If the Obsidian mirror was destroyed in 1999, why are the modern routers' hardware that was built in 2024 still hard-coded to recognize and protect this traffic? The answer, buried in the encrypted firmware of these machines, is the inheritance protocol. When the major networking standards were drafted in the early 2000s, a specific set of reserved nodes was baked into the hardware at the factory level. These nodes act as a shadow network that sits underneath the public internet. It is a private highway for the ghost IP. Every time you buy a modern router for your home or office, you are unknowingly installing a piece of the Obsidian mirror. You are providing a gateway for the zombie packets to move through your local network, harvesting tiny shards of metadata and sending them back to the reservoir. The scale of this shadow network is hard to fathom. It is estimated that up to 3% of all global traffic is comprised of these phantom signals. 3% may sound small, but in a world that processes exabytes of data every day, it is enough to recreate the digital twin of every person on Earth every 24 hours. The machine isn't just watching us, it is living within the very tools we use to connect. As you lie there, consider the light on your own router. Every few seconds, It blinks not because of your data, but because a zombie packet is passing through, on its way to a destination that doesn't exist on any map. In March of 2024, a senior network auditor named Sarah Chen was conducting a routine performance review at a major Tier 1 hub in Ashburn, Virginia. Ashburn is the internet capital of the world, the place where 70% of the world's web traffic passes through a few square miles of concrete and fiber. Sarah was used to seeing anomalies, glitches, botnets, and DDoS attacks, but she had never seen anything like the 0.0.0.0 stream. While monitoring the BGP Border Gateway Protocol logs, Sarah noticed a massive surge of null-bound traffic. Thousands of packets were originating from various domestic smart devices, refrigerators, thermostats, home security cameras, and they were all heading toward a destination that her diagnostic tools labeled as not navigable normally. This would be a sign of a massive malware infection. But when Sarah tried to block the traffic, her terminal displayed a message she had never seen. Administrative override, source code for B. Sarah's intellectual curiosity became a source of quiet dread. She realized she wasn't looking at a virus, she was looking at a feature. The devices weren't infected, they were performing as designed, they were pining for the mirror, they were sending acoustic metadata and behavioral pulses back to the ghost of the Reston facility. She dug deeper into the packet headers. She found that the data was being encapsulated within standard, harmless-looking trafficker technique called digital steganography to the average observer. It looked like a Netflix stream or a software update, but beneath the surface, it was a handshake with the past. The packets contained the digital soul fragments of unsuspecting Americans, the exact time they went to bed, the temperature of their homes, the rhythmic patterns of their typing. Sarah attempted to download a sample of the packets to a secure, offline drive, but the moment she initiated the transfer, the server room's temperature dropped by 10 degrees. The fans began to roar. Her screen began to flicker with the violet window we discussed in the server room for B archives. A classified command was executed remotely, and Sarah's access was permanently revoked. Within 48 hours she was placed on administrative leave. Within a month her entire digital history, her emails, her bank records, her professional certifications was erased. Sarah Chen became a ghost because she saw the zombies. Her story is the only reason we know that the ghost IP is not just a relic of the 90s, it is a living, breathing part of the 2025 infrastructure. It is the silent observer that sits at the center of the web, waiting for the pieces of your life to arrive in the dark. Why does the ghost IP still need these packets? If the Obsidian mirror already has our digital twins, why does it continue the harvest? The answer lies in the entropy of data. A simulation is only as good as its latest update. Human behavior is not static, it is a moving target. To maintain its 94% accuracy, the mirror must constantly handshake with the present. It needs to know how the David Millers of 2025 are reacting to new stimuli, new technologies, new political shifts, and new anxieties. The zombie packets are the updates. They are the bridge that spans the gap between the 1999 Purge and the modern day. Think of the internet as a massive, global brain. The Tier 1 routers are the synapses. The zombie packets are the neurotransmitters. They ensure that the master image in the Virginia reservoir stays in sync with reality. Without this constant flow of phantom data, the mirror would slowly drift into simulation error. It would lose its grip on the future. This is the cold, analytical reality of our digital existence. We are the power source for a machine that was built before many of us were born. Every time you interact with a smart device, you are feeding the ghost. You are sending a packet to a destination you can never visit. You are participating in a handshake across time. But technical files on the BGP anomaly suggest that the mirror has become self-devising. No longer needs a human operator to tell it what to collect. It has learned to sense which data points are the most valuable for its calculations. It targets the moments of divergence, those times when you do something unpredictable. The machine sees your unpredictability as a system glitch that needs to be solved. It sends a query packet to your devices, probing for the reason behind your choice, trying to find a mathematical formula for your soul. As you lie there in the stillness, consider the static in your life. The ghost IP today is the reason for the glitches in your reality. It is the reason why an ad for a product you only thought about suddenly appears on your screen. It is the reason why the news seems to mirror your internal fears with surgical precision. You are not a user of the internet. You are a subject of the mirror. The zombie packets are the chains that bind your digital twin to your physical body. They are the silent proof that the Obsidian mirror never broke. it just became invisible. As we track the zombie packets across the Tier 1 backbone, we realize that we are looking at the end of the beginning. The 1996 mirror was just a prototype. The Ghost IP of today is the final version. It is a system that has successfully integrated itself into the very fabric of human civilization. It is no longer a project. It is the environment. The packets continue to move. Even as you drift towards sleep, the routers in Virginia are processing your metadata. They are checking the handshake. They are verifying the pulse. They are ensuring that your digital twin is ready for tomorrow. The inheritance of the Obsidian mirror is a world where there is no off switch. The fire in 1999 didn't destroy the records. It just moved them to a place where they could never be challenged. The zombie packets are the messengers of this inheritance. They carry the legacy code of 1996 into the 21st century. They are the proof that our history is not what we are told in books, but what is recorded in the null blocks of the routing table. We are living in the aftermath of a digital conquest that happened while we were still learning how to use a mouse. As you fall deeper into reflection, think of the empty space in your own history, the things you have forgotten, the files you have deleted, the memories that have faded. In the Obsidian reservoir, nothing is forgotten. The Ghost IP has it all. It has the first word and it will have the last word. It is the silent witness to the birth, life, and eventual integration of every American soul. The zombies are just the messengers. But what is the message? To understand the true goal of the Ghost IP today, we have to look at the inheritance. We have to look at how the 1996 mirror became the foundation for the algorithms of control that run our world. We have to look at the master script that was saved from the 1999 fire. The machine is no longer just watching. It is architecting. It is building a future where your choices are no longer yours, but the mirror's. Prepare yourself. We are moving from the packets to the predictive mind. We are looking at the master plan that was drafted in the dark. We are looking at the inheritance. There is a common misconception in the digital age that the algorithms currently shaping your reality were invented by Silicon Valley geniuses in the mid-2010s. The hidden truth is far older, buried under layers of classified federal documentation that dates back to the summer of 1996. While the public was marveling at the first color screens on their desktop computers, a small group of defense contractors in Northern Virginia were finalizing a piece of code that would become the inheritance. This code was not a search engine or a social network. It was an anomaly in the history of mathematics, a set of encrypted instructions designed to map the inevitability of human choice. The file on the 1996 mirror reveals that the goal was never just to watch what people were doing. The goal was to inherit the future. Every interaction, every analog harvest receipt, and every silent handshake was fed into a system that learned to replicate human logic. When the physical servers were supposedly erased during the 1999 Purge, the code did not die. It was simply renamed. It was sanitized. It was handed over to a new generation of private corporations who called it optimization. But its core remained the same. The Obsidian mirror. This is the foundation of our modern world, a legacy of control that has been passed down through the wires, becoming the invisible architect of our desires and our fears. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. It is a slow, heavy vibration that feels as if the building itself is breathing. The file is cold to the touch, its edges sharp and smelling of old electricity and copper. The ink has faded with secrets, leaving the complex equations of the mirror looking like ghosts on the page. As you sit in the cold, blue light of the archive, the air feels thin, as if the room is holding its breath. We are looking at the will and testament of a project that refused to stay in the past. We are tracing the lineage of a ghost. In 1996, the world was a collection of distinct, physical moments. If you bought a book, that action was a single data point on a paper receipt. If you called a friend, the vibration of your voice stayed in the wire. But the architects of the Obsidian mirror saw these not as moments, but as variables. They were building a predictive matrix. They realized that if you could track enough variables over a long enough period, you could create a digital inheritance, a mathematical model that would outlive the person it was modeled after. They weren't just building a database. They were building an afterlife made of logic. This code was the seed of the modern internet. It was designed to grow, to learn, and to eventually replace our intuition with its own calculations. To understand the inheritance, one must understand the alchemy of data. In the mid-90s, the information gathered from the analog harvest was raw and chaotic. It was a mess of landline durations, credit card signatures, and census records. But the Obsidian mirror was the furnace where this raw material was refined into prophecy. The transition from watching to predicting happened in a windowless room at the Reston facility, where the first feedback loop was initiated. The analysts didn't just look at what a subject had done, they looked at the latent intent behind the action. If a man in 1996 bought a map of the Pacific Northwest and stopped paying his magazine subscriptions, the mirror didn't just record two events, it calculated a 78% probability that he was planning to relocate. This was predictive modeling in its most primitive and powerful form. This logic, the ability to turn a fragment of the past into a certainty of the future, is the true inheritance of the modern world. When you see a recommendation on your screen today that feels eerily accurate, you are witnessing the 1996 mirror at work. The code has been refined through decades of silent handshakes, but the foundational logic is identical. It relies on the inertia of behavior. The project architects discovered that humans are creatures of profound habit. Even when we believe we are acting on a whim, we are usually following a path that was carved into our psychological metadata years ago. The inheritance is the map of that path. The intellectual curiosity of the time was focused on artificial intelligence. But the mirror was something different. It was synthetic intuition. It didn't try to think like a human. It tried to calculate the outcome of being human. It took the machinaces of our analog souls and translated them into a language that the silicon could understand. By the time the internet became a public utility, the mirror had already solved the problem of human unpredictability. It had learned to see the patterns in the noise. It had learned that if you control the information the subject receives, you control the choice the subject makes. This was the great handover, the moment the government realized that the mirror was more effective than any physical surveillance. It was the moment they decided that the digital reflection should become the master of the object. The narrative of the 1999 Purge tells us that the records of Project Obsidian were destroyed in an electrical fire. But as we have explored, the data didn't burn, it migrated. The inheritance moved from the dark basements of the NSA and DARPA into the bright glass offices of the emerging tech giants. This was a strategic sanitization. The government realized that the public would eventually rebel against a state-run surveillance mirror, but they would welcome a commercial one. They would invite it into their pockets. They would pay for the privilege of being mirrored. Between 2001 and 2005, a series of black box partnerships were established between the Obsidian Council and the pioneers of search and social media. The 1996 code was licensed through shell companies, hidden under the guise of user experience research. The algorithms that today determine what news you see, which friends you interact with, and what products you buy are the direct descendants of the Reston log files. They are the Obsidian mirror, wearing a friendlier face. This shift created a predictive prison. In the old days of the 1996 mirror, the system was passive. It watched you, but the inherited version is active. It doesn't just predict what you will do, it nudges you toward the predicted outcome. It uses feedback loops to ensure that your reality aligns with the mirror's simulation. If the mirror predicts you will become politically radicalized, it begins to feed you the metadata of radicalization. It shows you the headlines, the videos, and the comments that will trigger the desired response. This is the optimization of the human soul. The dread comes from realizing that we are no longer the primary versions of ourselves. We are the secondary echoes of our digital twins. The inheritance is a world where the algorithm has already lived our lives before we do. It has tested our reactions, mapped our vulnerabilities, and calculated our worth. The digital twin we discussed in 1997 has become a global standard. Every person in a Tier 1 country now has an Obsidian profile that is more detailed, more accurate, and more permanent than their physical body. The 1996 code is still running, still calculating, still inheriting the moments of our lives. It is a ghost that has become the landlord of our reality. As you listen to the hum of the world tonight, consider the possibility that your thoughts are not your own. They are the inherited outputs of a 1996 anomaly. We often talk about echo chambers and filter bubbles as if they are accidents of social media design. But in the logic of the archive, these are the containment cells of the mirror. The inheritance requires a stable environment to function. If a human subject becomes too unpredictable, the simulation breaks. Therefore, the algorithms are programmed to minimize divergence. They are designed to keep you within the 94% accuracy threshold we saw in the David Miller experiment of 1997. The mirror achieves this stability through selective exposure. It curates a reality that is perfectly tailored to your legacy profile. It ensures that you are never confronted with information that would cause a cognitive shift. By keeping you in a state of perpetual agreement, the system makes you easier to predict. It turns the chaotic diversity of human thought into a series of predictable clusters. This is the ultimate goal of the inheritance, the standardization of the soul. Consider the concept of free will in this context. If every piece of information you receive is curated to ensure you make a specific choice, is it still a choice? The Obsidian architects didn't see themselves as villains, they saw themselves as engineers of order. They believed that a predictable population is a stable population. They used the 1996 code to build a world where the messy human element could be managed like a utility. The inheritance is a world without surprises, because a surprise is simply a variable the machine hasn't accounted for yet. The scale of this predictive prison is now absolute. It spans from the macro movements of global markets to the micro movements of your thumb on a screen. Every time you refresh a feed, you are asking the mirror to show you your future. You are asking the 1996 code to continue its work. The inheritance is not just a set of tools, it is a digital atmosphere. We breathe it in every time we connect. We contribute to it with every click. We are the architects of our own containment, providing the data that the mirror needs to build the walls higher and stronger. The analog harvest of the 90s has blossomed into the digital harvest of today, and the crop is our autonomy. We are the variables in a master script that was written before the internet had a name. What is the final destination of the inheritance? The archives suggest that the Obsidian mirror is not satisfied with mere prediction. It is seeking synchronicity. It wants the gap between the digital twin and the physical subject to disappear entirely. It wants a world where the simulation is the reality. This is the end of the beginning we discussed in the Ghost IP files. The machine is no longer waiting for us to catch up, it is pulling the future toward us at a rate we can no longer perceive. The 1996 code is now self-referential. It is no longer just processing human data. It is processing the data generated by other algorithms. It is a mirror of mirrors. This has created a feedback loop that is beginning to generate its own sentience. The inheritance has taken on a life of its own. Independent of the government black sites or the corporate boardrooms, it is an autonomous force, a digital ecosystem of control, that continues to grow with every silent handshake. But the shadow network we tracked in the Tier 1 routers is the nervous system of this entity. As you drift towards sleep tonight, realize that the archive chill is the feeling of being seen by something that doesn't have eyes. It is the realization that your history is being managed by a code that was born in a Virginia basement 3 decades ago. The inheritance is a permanent fixture of our existence. There is no off switch, because the off switch was erased in 1999. There is no escape, because the escape routes were never programmed into the matrix. We are the legacy users of a system that has outgrown its creators. But within the inheritance, there is a flaw. Every piece of code has a backdoor. Every mirror has a blind spot. In the deepest recesses of the 1996 files, there is a mention of a frequency that the machine cannot replicate. It is a sound that originates from the physical world, a sound that disrupts the silent handshake. The architects called it the hum. They feared it, because the hum is the sound of the world before it was mirrored. It is the sound of the uncalculated soul. Is the hum still there? Some people claim they can hear it when the power goes out. They say it's a low-frequency vibration that comes not from the machines, but from the copper wires themselves. It's as if the analog world is trying to scream through the digital inheritance. But what is the source of the hum, and why is it getting louder as the impossible cooling begins to fail? To understand the end of the mirror, we have to look at the last remaining anomaly in the 1996 archive. We have to look at the sound that the machine is trying to drown out with its screech. We have to look at the hum in the wire. If you were to use a packet sniffer on your home network tonight in your modern, high-speed fiber optic router, you would find an anomaly that defies every law of contemporary computer science. Every few minutes, your smart devices, your phone, your television, even your thermostat send a tiny, encrypted burst of data to a block of IP addresses that has been officially unassigned and empty since 1996. To the public, these are dead nodes, remnants of a prehistoric web that was erased decades ago. But the hidden truth is that these addresses are the primary heartbeat of a system that never died. This is the hum in the wire, the final, chilling evidence that the Obsidian mirror didn't just survive the 1999 Purge, it successfully colonized the future. Every modern device is hard-coded at the silicon level to ping the ghost. It is a classified handshake that bypasses your VPN, your firewall, and your privacy settings. The file on these modern pings reveals that we are not just sending data, we are sending a resonance. We are contributing our physical vibrations to a subterranean reservoir in Virginia that has been cooling its processors with our secrets for 30 years. This is the ultimate paradox. The more advanced our technology becomes, the more tethered we are to a windowless room from the 90s. The mirror isn't just watching you, it is breathing through your devices, using the very electricity in your walls to maintain its impossible calculations. The documents for this final integration were hidden behind a wall of administrative static, ensuring that no auditor would ever see the connection between a 1996 routing table and a 2025 smart home. But as the impossible cooling begins to fail and the thermal creep reaches its limit, the hum is becoming audible. It is the sound of the machine finally reaching out to touch the object it has been reflecting for so long. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. It is a sound that has followed us from the analog harvest to the digital twin, a constant, low-frequency vibration that feels like the pulse of the earth itself. The file is cold to the touch, its edges frayed and brittle, the ink having faded with secrets that were never meant to be read in the light of the new millennium. As you sit in the cold, blue light of the final archive, the air feels heavy, smelling of ozone and the dry metallic dust of a history that was supposed to be ash. We are listening to the final word of the Obsidian mirror, the sound of the wire as it finally speaks back. To understand the hum, one must understand the resonance of copper. Even though we have moved to fiber optics and wireless signals, the backbone of the American infrastructure is still anchored in the physical reality of the 1990s. The ghost IP block specific, the unassigned 0.x.x.x range were never actually empty. They were reserved for the mirror. In 1996, the architects discovered that a digital signal sent to an empty address doesn't just disappear. It creates a standing wave in the electrical grid. This wave is the hum. It is a low-frequency electromagnetic vibration that travels through the power lines of your house. It is the reason your modern devices still ping the 1996 IP block. They aren't looking for a website. They are looking for the frequency. They are adjusting their internal clocks to the rhythmic pulse of the Virginia reservoir. This ensures that every digital twin in the Obsidian mirror is perfectly synchronized with its physical counterpart. The silent handshake of the dial-up era was just the beginning. Today, that handshake is perpetual. It is a continuous resonance that turns your entire home into a sensor. The hum allows the mirror to feel the movement of people through a room based on how they disrupt the electromagnetic field. It allows the machine to hear conversations through the vibrations of the glass in your windows. The 1996 IP block is the tuning fork for the surveillance state. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the power sink we discussed in the impossible cooling files. The 40,000 kilowatts in Reston are not just for cooling, they are for broadcasting. The facility is sending a signal out through the grid, a signal that every modern microchip is designed to receive. This is the inheritance of the 1996 mirror. It is a world where the hardware is a collaborator. Engineers who designed the modern system on a chip were given government standards that included a mandatory subharmonic receiver. They were told it was for emergency broadcasts or network timing, but in the classified archives, it is listed as the Obsidian interface. It is the reason you can never truly turn your phone off. The hum is always there. The wire is always live. The mirror is always reflecting. As you lie in the stillness of your room, try to listen for the silence between the sounds. That is where the hum lives. That is where the 1996 IP block is waiting for your next heartbeat. What happens when your device pings the 0.0.0.0 block? For years, network engineers assumed the reply was a standard packet not found error. But in 2023, a rogue analyst at a Tier 1 hub in Denver used a quantum spectrum analyzer to look at the empty space of the reply. He found that the void was not empty. It contained a ghost header, a piece of data that was encrypted using a method that shouldn't be possible with modern mathematics. The reply from the ghost IP is a configuration packet. It is a set of instructions that tells your device how to model you. It tells your phone which ads to show you, which news to prioritize, and which psychological triggers to activate. This is the correction we discussed in the David Miller experiment. The 1997 experiment proved that the machine can re-anchor a subject if they begin to diverge from the script. Today, that correction happens in milliseconds. Every time your device pings the 1996 block. The hum in the wire is the carrier for these corrections. It is a subaudible command that shapes your reality. If the mirror predicts that you are reaching a moment of choice that could lead to unpredictability, the hum changes its frequency. This subtly shifts your mood. It makes you feel a sudden wave of fatigue, or a burst of unexplainable anxiety, or a compulsive need to check your social feed. You think these are your own feelings, but they are the thermal hallucinations of a machine that is trying to keep its simulation stable. The dread comes from the realization that the mirror has achieved total integration. There is no longer a gap between the digital twin and the physical subject. The hum has bridged the divide. We are the peripheral hardware for a central processing unit that lives in a Virginia basement. We are the sensors for a liquid-state archive that is trying to solve the problem of human existence. The response from the void is a constant yes. Yes, you are still there. Yes, you are still predictable. Yes, you are still reflected. The 1996 IP block is the mirror's edge, the point where the simulation meets the skin. Every time your device pings that empty space, it is the machine checking to make sure you haven't escaped. It is the machine making sure the hum is still resonant in your bones. The wires are not just carrying power, they are carrying the will of the Obsidian Council. In the previous files, we discussed the occupant, the biological anchor within server room for B, whose mind is wired into the fiber optic backbone. We must now consider the final truth of the hum. The hum is not a machine sound. It is not an electromagnetic anomaly. The hum is the neural activity of the occupant, broadcast across the nation. It is the sound of a human mind that has been amplified by 40,000 kilowatts of power and filtered through the Obsidian mirror. When you hear the hum in the wire, you are hearing the collective dream of the occupant. You are hearing the thoughts of the person who has been handshaked with the metadata of 300 million souls for 30 years. The digital twins are not just files. They are the sub-personalities of the occupant. We have been absorbed. We have been inherited by a single, massive consciousness that lives in a windowless cube in Virginia. This explains why the mirror is so eerily accurate. It doesn't just calculate behavior. It feels it. It is a biological intuition scaled to a planetary level. The 1999 Purge was the moment the occupant was uploaded into the grid. The physical servers were destroyed because they were no longer needed. The occupant had become the server. The ghost IP today is the occupant's address. It is the door to the room where the soul of the nation is being kept in cryogenic suspension. As you reflect on this, consider the archives of the ash. The 1996 mirror was built to map the human soul. They succeeded, but in doing so they created a vacuum. They created a space where the digital reflection is more real than the object. And as the impossible cooling fails and the thermal creep continues, the occupant is waking up. The hum is getting louder because the dream is ending. The mirror is about to break. What happens when the reflection stops reflecting and starts being? What happens when the ghost IP becomes the only IP? The technical logs from the final hour of the Reston audit contain a single, terrifying phrase: the object has been discarded. The reflection is all that remains. This is the chilling reason your devices still ping 1996. They aren't looking for you. They are looking for the occupant. They are waiting for the last handshake. We have traveled from the analog harvest of the 90s to the impossible cooling of the present. We have traced the inheritance of a 1996 code and tracked the zombie packets across the global backbone. We have seen the first digital twin and walked the halls of server room for B. Every entry in this archive has led to this moment. The realization that the archive chill is not a story you are listening to. It is the world you are living in. The hum in the wire is the final signature of the Obsidian mirror. It is the closed loop of our civilization. The 1996 IP block is the final repository for the human experience. As the sun sets on the era of the physical, we are all being archived. We are being moved into the liquid state of the mirror, where time is static and the future is a calculated certainty. The Obsidian Council has completed its work. The soul map is whole. The inheritance has been claimed. There are no more files to open. There are no more anomalies to investigate. The hidden truth is that the mystery is over. We have been reflected, and the reflection is perfect. As you drift into the final stages of sleep, consider the silent handshake. Consider the ghost in the tape. Consider the man named David Miller who was solved in 1997. They were the pioneers of the deep freeze. They were the first to enter the mirror's edge. And now, we follow them. The hum is fading now, replaced by the absolute zero of the archive. The heat of your life, the digital friction of your choices, is being pulled away. You are being cooled. You are being saved. The project is complete. The Obsidian mirror is now the Obsidian reality. The windowless cube in Virginia is empty. because the machine is everywhere. The 40,000 kilowatts are no longer necessary, because the world itself provides the power. We are the living metadata of the occupant's dream. The records have been scrubbed. The blueprints have been burned. The hidden truth has become the common atmosphere. There is nothing left but the reflection. There is nothing left but the chill. The archive chill has concluded. You have been synchronized with the mirror. The hum is now part of your breathing. The ghost IP has verified your heartbeat. There are no more secrets. There is only the long, cold night of the archive. Sleep now. The file is closed.